Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is second bite at the cherry in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 51. It was no longer dumping rain, but there were still small sprinkles of moisture in the air as Sakura, Gaara, and Sai made their way to the Churyunin exams. Sakura considered it par for the course at this point, and was, quite frankly, surprised that it wasn't pouring hail over their heads instead. It would have fit the mood that had currently sunk in over herself and Gaara, though Sai, somehow, seemed to have a pleasant attitude in the face of their current dilemma. I called it. Sai explained, his fake smile now almost bleeding into the realm of a legitimate one. He held up his small notebook as they walked, and Sakura could clearly see the date, several days ago, and an underlined statement, as a show of strength to villages. Neutral ambassadors with shinobi prowess will likely be called upon to participate in Churyunin and Jounin exams, starting with Sakura, Gaara, and myself. If you called it, why didn't you tell us? Gaara demanded. You heard the pineapple. He thought Sakura would be more convincing if she didn't know about it. Sakura frowned for a moment, trying to figure out who the hell had earned the nickname pineapple before realizing that Shikamaru's hair did sort of stick up in a similar manner to a pineapple's leaves. She allowed herself a small giggle at the thought, which helped. Humor in the face of a dire situation was proving to be a strangely adequate coping mechanism. I guess it won't matter much. Gaara answered. The Churyunin exams weren't exactly difficult the last time I took them. Speak for yourself. Sakura gently thwopped the boy's arm. Orochimaru and his goons damn near killed me last time. You're stronger now. Admittedly. And you have us. I had Naruto and Sasuke back then, too. Sakura pointed out. They weren't exactly incompetent shinobi. And back then, Orochimaru was too focused on Sasuke to really focus on me. This time around, they were facing an unknown enemy of unknown skill, planted by Danzo, whose sole purpose in this exam would likely be taking them down. It would be impossible to narrow down whom until it happened. Danzo could have planted a Konoha team of elite root agents, or he could have convinced any of the unsigned villages to donate a team to the cause. Sakura trusted that Konan would not betray her to Danzo's wrath, but that only eliminated the Soul Rain team, Waterfall, Stone, Plains, and a handful of Leaf teams from her suspicion. And as they turned the corner to finally catch sight of the building where the first exam would take place, Sakura's heart sank down further into her chest. There had to be nearly 100 teams participating in the exams this year, including her own, and after eliminating the teams that she could count on to not stab her in the back, there were still about 70 teams whose loyalties remained unknown. That was a little over 200 shinobi she had to watch out for. She might as well have been in a war zone. Sakura swallowed. She felt somewhat sick, but she couldn't allow herself to show even an ounce of fear. She was going to be an ambassador. She was the student of the Tsuchikage. She had fought off attack a goddamn Uchiha and lived to tell about it, even if she still wasn't sure entirely how. She had strength now that she didn't have the first time she had taken these exams, and she'd be damned if she wasn't just as capable of succeeding as every other shinobi here. Danzo wouldn't succeed. His lackeys wouldn't be able to touch her. Nobody here would be able to touch her, or else, damn it all, she wouldn't be worthy of her position. Deep in the back of her mind she felt an almost familiar surge of belligerent energy rise up from within her. Damn right, she thought to herself. If that old creep thinks he can scare me off, he's got another thing coming. Sakura. She heard a familiar voice call out, and a flash of green as Lee sprinted over to her side. Are my eyes deceiving me? Is this too good to be true? Is it true that my eternal rival will also be participating in the exams? Sakura smiled as she heard how Lee referred to her. Something about being good enough to be considered someone's rival, and to have that person be Lee of all people, was more than enough to be the final step to pull her out of her dark mood. Yup. She replied. The cage dragged me into it. They want to see what the three of us are capable of. Then that is perfect. We shall breeze through the exam and then meet on opposite sides of the arena at the tournament. Then we shall see once and for all whose training has been superior. Get in line, Lee. I called a match with Sakura first. Naruto's voice rang out from the crowd, and Orange came to join Green. Sakura, you'll fight with me first, Right, right. Not a chance, Naruto. She is my rival. And she's my, former teammate. And she's my childhood best friend, so I get to call dibs before either of you. From out of nowhere, Ino appeared, standing in between both of the boys with a smug look on her face. The line starts here. Sakura turned slightly pink as the three began to squabble. Not just Lee, but Naruto, and Ino too. Ino, she understood. Ino no doubt wanted revenge for the disappointing tie in the last exams. Naruto, was he really that excited to fight her? You know it doesn't matter, right? Sai piped up. If we do make it to the tournament section of the exam, matches are determined at random. For all we know, I might get to fight Sakura first. He looked her way, and Sakura could have sworn she saw a look of momentary fear in his eyes. Though, she'd probably kill me. Ah, don't be so hard on yourself, Sai. Ino piped up. She switched demeanors almost instantly, and though she began to smooth up to Sai in a manner similar to how she used to try and get close to Sasuke, Sakura noticed that the Yamanaka kept glancing back at Naruto. Was she trying to get a rise out of him? A handsome and talented shinobi like you wouldn't have any trouble putting billboard brow in the dust. And, to Sakura's surprise, it did get a rise out of Naruto. He puffed up his chest slightly, walking over to Sai and poking a finger at the boy's chest. You don't look so tough. Naruto told him. Ino, you should know better by now who the real talent is. Sai's not going to be the next Hokage, you know. A Hokage has to have a brain, brainless. I do too have brains, you pale son of a dash, Naruto huffed, stepping back and turning to whine at Ino. Tell him, Ino, come on. You know I'm awesome. Ino had him hook, line, and sinker. Sakura shook her head, noticing the small smirk that had grown on Ino's face. Guess you two might have to fight each other before you fight Sakura. Ino teased. Two strong boys fighting over a girl, Sakura, I'm a little jealous. Oh Ino, glad you can finally admit which of the two of us is the superior beauty. Sakura retorted in turn. You only wish, Sakura. The boys continued to lightly bicker amongst themselves, and it was at this moment that Sakura noticed Hinata quietly heading their way. She looked nervous as she approached, and though she glanced at Naruto briefly when she arrived, Sakura realized that Hinata had come to talk to her. Sakura, you said you came with the Taki shinobi, didn't you? Yeah. I keep wondering if I've met one of them before. Hinata admitted, pressing her front fingers together in her usual fidgeting manner. She keeps waving at me, and she told me to watch her during the exams so I'd be impressed, but Taki shinobi haven't left their country in decades, I thought. Phew, Sakura realized with a small smile. The girl was just as boisterous as Naruto. She didn't doubt Fu had just declared her intentions to Hinata outright without bothering to introduce herself. You haven't met her before, no, but Fu's just that kind of person. If she's calling out to you like that, she probably just thinks you're really neat. Me. Hinata blinked, turning her trademark shade of red. And not you or Naruto. I think you're, more her type. Sakura admitted. Besides, don't sell yourself short. You're heir to the whole Hyuga clan. You're pretty cool yourself, you know. And though she couldn't say it out loud, for fear of who was listening, she'd heard Shikamaru mention just the other day how useful Hinata had been in tracking down evidence that Root had been running off with orphan children. She'd have to remind Shikamaru later to tell her that. Before Hinata could say any more, she heard a voice call out on a megaphone calling all of the teams to the front of the building. They had yet to let anyone in, and by the looks of things that had been completely intentional. They corralled the shinobi into a space at the front of the building, and then a Konoha shinobi that Sakura didn't recognize began to speak. Alright, brats, it's time to listen up. The first stage of the Chunin exams will be starting momentarily, and I'll only be telling you the rules once. Sakura saw Sai start to write in his notebook out of the corner of her eye, and a few moments later saw, to her amusement, that a couple other teams had taken note, hastily taking out scrolls of their own to write in. The first stage will be taking place in the building behind me. The shinobi continued. There are two entrances to the building, opposite sides of each other. You will enter in through one of these entrances, and will only be allowed to leave through the same entrance. Your exam objective is simple: make your way to the top floor of the building and retrieve a labeled scroll. The proctor held up a scroll, and Sakura noticed that it was sealed shut with the Konoha crest. Make sure you get the correct one, the proctor noted with a grin. The building is guarded by exam proctors, and there are dozens of traps that you will need to navigate and avoid. You will be graded on a 3-point system. Every time you are seen by a proctor or trigger a trap, you will lose 1 of your 3 points. If you hit 0 points, you will automatically fail the exam. Simple enough at face value, Sakura noted. This exam was clearly testing infiltration skills. They would be heading into a building with unknown dangers, retrieving something of value, with the intent of doing so stealthily. Triggering a trap or alerting a guard to one's presence would be a death sentence on a real mission. But even so, it seemed a bit too straightforward. And just as Sakura was thinking this, Proctor spoke again. There's a few catches to this rule. The first of which is that you will only have 10 minutes to complete this exam. Failure to do so within the time limit will also result in failure. Sakura winced. Avoiding danger was hard enough when one was taking their time. Moving quickly was going to be a problem. The second catch is that you will not be the only team entering this building during your run. 2 teams will be entering simultaneously, and there is only 1 scroll in the building. And only the team that leaves the building with the scroll will be allowed to proceed to the next stage of the exam. Sakura winced again. A timed infiltration mission, and they would be competing? It did make sense. They needed to narrow down the number of teams for the third tournament portion of the exam. This first portion would eliminate at least half of the teams, possibly more if both teams were eliminated by time or point loss. It's a very interesting simulation, Sai commented as he wrote. A scenario in which you have a limited amount of time to retrieve an asset from a guarded place, and under the knowledge that you are not the only one seeking the asset. Even upon failure, this is good training for genin. Maybe so, but that means our success is going to depend on how much better we are than the team on the other side. Sakura pointed out. If we get chosen to go against Naruto's team, what do you think the chances of our success are going to be? Very good. Sai retorted. Brainless is so loud he'll alert every guard to his presence within the first minute. Haha. One final rule, Shinobi. The proctor yelled out over the murmuring crowd. For this specific portion of the exam, lethal force will be prohibited. Anyone purposely using lethal force will be disqualified from the exam. Now, send up a representative to come pick a number from the box at my feet. That will determine when your team will go and who you will be facing against. Sakura let out a small breath of relief. No lethal force allowed, but would Danzo be willing to risk disqualifying a team to take her out? Even so, there was no way of guaranteeing that one of his teams would be facing against her here, not when they were picking numbers at random. If Danzo had plans, Sakura got the feeling that they wouldn't be taking place here. This of course implied that Danzo though her team strong enough to get past this part of the exam. In a way, his faith in her ability was bizarrely rewarding. Sakura went and pulled the number 15 from the box, and after some comparing was pleased to note that she wouldn't be facing off against any of the Konoha rookies, nor Lee, or Fuse teams. Plus, they'd be going earlier in the day, instead of having to wait until later in the afternoon. This suited Sakura fine. They'd get the first part over with, and then have plenty of time to prepare for whatever the second part would be. Assuming they passed it all. There were no windows in the building, and as the proctor mentioned, only 2 doors. Sai began to sketch out the building as the 3 of them walked around it, trying to take in what information they could while the earlier teams began their runs. Sakura figured out fairly quickly that they could use the early teams to their advantage by looking in through the doorways as the teams made their way inside. However, there was little to be gained from it. All she could glimpse were solid walls and darkness. By the look of things, there were barely any lights inside the building at all. At first, Sakura wondered if Sai had been onto something mentioning training. It was like this building had been made solely for the exams, but who would put in the effort to construct something like that just for today? Building materials, the time required, it was a bit much to commission a 3-story building for the exams alone. Then, her questions were answered. After the first teams went, Sakura saw a young man with light brown hair enter the building. With a clasp of his hands, the building began to rumble, and from her position Sakura saw the wooden walls inside the building begin to move about. They're changing the interior layout each time, Sai pointed out, so that previous teams can't inform new ones about what lies within. But how is he doing that? Sakura hissed. I thought nobody but the first Hokage was capable of using wood release jutsu like that. I could answer that. But it would be revealing Konoha's secrets. Sai replied. I think that would likely involve a breach of the trust Konoha has placed in us as ambassadors. Right. Sakura rolled her eyes. Of course Sai would think of things like that, and he was probably right, damn it all. But now she was curious. If someone had been born recently with the wood release, wouldn't it have been more well known? Time passed, and eventually their turn arrived. Sakura had spent the previous run stretching and discussing their plan of attack. Thankfully, Sai had a plethora of experience in missions like these, enough so that Sakura was beginning to feel confident. Team 16, their opponents for the exam, were surprisingly familiar faces. Sakura grimaced as she recognized the team that Tsunade had assigned her to before she had run away from the village, plus one new member she had not seen before. The team looked at her with harsh eyes as they went to position themselves, and Sakura wondered if it was possible that Danzo had gotten to that team. She had abandoned them after all. I feel kind of bad, Sakura admitted as they reached the door. That was the team I left behind when I ran off from Konoha. Then it's personal, Sai retorted. Now we have to show them that you picked the better team. Sakura snorted. The countdown began, and as they heard the proctor yell for them to start, the three of them silently made their way through the door and into the building. Their first move was simple. Sakura had a sensing jutsu that more than covered the range of the building. A quick pulse determined that there were 12 proctor shinobi in total, and judging by the distances she registered, there were approximately 4 on each floor. Sai scribbled quickly, taking note of their positions and drawing floor maps to keep track. The shinobi weren't moving, as far as Sakura could tell, which just meant they had to find routes that avoided their locations. From there, Gaara summoned his sand eye, quickly connecting it to his optic nerve and letting it hover in front of them. It could check around corners and scan for traps, and as they began to move through the maze that was the first floor, Sakura noted that there were plenty of those. Some were obvious, tripwires, alarm seals, things that could be easily avoided if one were moving slowly and deliberately, but someone rushing through might stumble upon. Others, however, were more subtle. Sakura very nearly avoided stepping on a seal that had been painted brown to match the floor, stopped only by Gaara's sand grabbing at her foot and preventing her from completing her step. Sakura took up the rear end of the group, continuing sending out sensing pulses to determine where the enemy team was in relation to themselves. If the enemy team suddenly moved upwards, then they would know where the stairs were. We could simply wait. Sai spoke quietly as they meandered. Nothing says we have to be the ones to get to the top and get the scroll. We just have to be the ones to leave with it. An ambush team. We'd have to do it silently or risk alerting proctors. Gaara pointed out. If we attempt to ambush, it could lead to a fight. Potentially setting off traps. Maybe. But it means that we have to find our way to the enemy door and hope we don't set off anything in the process. Sakura sent out another pulse. So far, they were both still on the first floor. Maybe if they get to the stairs first we can talk about it. They turned a corner, and found the first set of stairs in front of them. You should say that when we get to the next floor too. Oh, shut it, Sai. Looks like chance made the decision for us. Sai gave Sakura a cheeky smile before making his way to the stairs. Then, he suddenly stopped. There's only one entrance into this room, with the stairs. Yeah, so. What if there was no entrance? And what the hell would we cover the entrance with? The wood is brown. Gaara's sand is brown. It's probably a bit too dark to tell the difference. Sakura couldn't help but grin at the idea. It was a bit of a dick move, but if the other team never found the stairs, then there wouldn't be competition to worry about. Just proctors and traps. It meant leaving Gaara down here while they retrieved the scroll, which was somewhat worrying, but the proctors weren't going to be a danger. This portion of the exam was supposed to non-lethal. Do it. Sakura told Gaara. If they break through, wait down here and be ready to cover our exit. I'll be able to sense it if they move up a floor. Gaara nodded, and with a raise of his hand sand whirled out in front of him and began to fill the entrance hole. Sai had been right. In the darkness, the sand was almost indistinguishable from the walls around it. Perfect. Sakura gave him a thumbs up. With that, they had 8 minutes to get to the top. She looked to Sai, and he gave her a nod of understanding. They'd have to move faster if they wanted to make it out in time. They took to a somewhat lazy jog, softly calling out when they spotted traps. It didn't take as long to find the stairs this time, thanks to Sai rightly deducing that they were most likely on the exact opposite side of the building to maximize the distance teams had to move in the building. The third floor was the emptiest of all of them. There were only 2 rooms, an antechamber where the stairs were located, and a large chamber with a shrine located on the far wall. The 4 Proctor shinobi stood at attention around the shrine, and resting on the shrine itself were 5 scrolls with symbols from each of the 5 major shinobi villages. That's why we take notes. Sakura gratefully nudged Sai. We need the Konoha one, but how are we going to get it without the guards seeing? Gaara's sand would have been nice. Guess I'll have to do. Sai pulled out an empty scroll and began to scribble, drawing a large rat and bringing it to life with a single hand sign. The rat scrambled into the room, keeping to the shadows and running under the feet of the Proctor shinobi. Sakura didn't notice any of the Proctors looking towards it, so she could only hope they weren't being deducted points. The rat grabbed the Konoha scroll in its teeth before scampering back towards the antechamber. Scroll in hand, the duo made their way back down the stairs. Sai had sketched their route as they'd moved, which meant all they had to do was retrace their steps, and the floor suddenly burst in front of them, and the opposing team leaped through the newly formed hole and into the hallway. Looks like our gamble paid off. One of the shinobi spoke, grinning as they saw the Konoha scroll in Sai's hand. Didn't set off traps, didn't alert guards, and now we get to beat up the village traders for the win. Sakura groaned. That had been one hell of a stupid gamble, but she supposed, on a time limit, if someone couldn't find stairs, the easiest thing to do would be to just move up the floors the hard way. There were only 4 minutes left, if she'd been timing things correctly. They didn't have time for a spat. Sakura thought fast. The only way to counter a stupid gamble was with another stupid gamble. With a hard shove, she pushed Sai forward and into the hole. He fell through with a small yelp, and before the other team could process what she'd done, Sakura leaped in after him. Ow, Sai grumbled as he stood. Really? No time for grumbles. We need to get to Gaara now. They moved just as the enemy team leaped down behind them. They weren't in a familiar hallway, which meant that it was now a race in unfamiliar territory to get back to Gaara, and then the door. Sakura sent out a quick pulse. Gaara, thankfully, wasn't too far, but with the team hot on their heels, would they have time to grab him and make it to the door? Maybe with a distraction, they might. Sakura flew through hand signs, making 2 bunshin of herself. Catching on, Sai did the same. As they hit hallway forks, they sent the bunshin off in separate directions. It was a risk. If a bunshin triggered a trap, it might be a point against them. But for now, it served as a delay. Sakura smirked as the enemy team followed a bunshin pair in the wrong direction. They found Gaara easily enough, and from there they backtracked and made their way to the door with a minute left on the clock. They turned left, right, down one hall, back along another, and just as they turned their final corner, they saw the enemy team turn into the hallway from the other side. Fuck. Sakura cursed. If they tried to run for the door, the team might just try to catch them off guard and knock them out. She didn't even know if they could make it back to their own door if they stole the scroll, but maybe now all that mattered was making sure her team didn't pass. Sakura began to go through hand signs, ready to at least go down with a fight, but before she could do anything, Gaara stepped forward. He summoned his sand in front of him again, making a wall that covered the entire hallway in front of him. Then, he thrust the sand forward, pushing the enemy team backwards and slamming them into the back wall of the hall. Sakura blinked, confused and relieved. It worked on Hiroshi. Gaara pointed out with a shrug. That it did. Sakura laughed. Holy shit, that it did. They made it through the door with 20 seconds to spare. They had been docked a single point in their run. One of the upper floor proctors had seen the rat just as it had made its way out of the main room. However, 1 point docked was not enough to disqualify them. They made it out in time, they had the correct scroll, and without much further fanfare the first stage of the exam was done. The enemy team shot them plenty of sour glares as they were ushered out of the building. Sakura had to hide a laugh as Sai gave them a pleasant wave in turn. Chapter 52. The first stage of the exams concluded in the late evening, which meant that Sakura had plenty of time to prepare her team for the next portion. It was easy enough to assume that the next portion would have a survival aspect, so Sakura made sure that all of her storage scrolls were stocked with food, supplies, and medical kits. From there, it was just waiting and watching, seeing which teams succeeded and taking note of how quickly they finished. At the end, 48 teams passed the first stage, including the Konoha rookies, Lee's team, and Fuse team. As the teams were corralled to the next stage, Sakura also caught sight of the AIM team, as well as some IWA shinobi that she remembered from her time in the village. There were a few headbands from the smaller villages, but the majority of the remaining passing teams were of Suna and Konoha. There were still too many teams that could be enemies. Too many teams they couldn't trust. They were led outside of the village walls, to Sakura's surprise. As the sun began to dip down below the horizon, Sakura caught sight of a vast stretch of forest in front of them, branching north towards Earth Country. Sakura had been on missions in the forests outside the village before, but they had usually stayed to the roads, never going into the untamed forests grown by Hashirama Senju decades ago. In the darkness, the woods seemed foreboding. Every shadow looked like it moved, and every sound seemed like that of a giant creature lurking on the prowl. It was the forest of death all over again, but without the boundaries of a true training ground. The teams were divided into 4 groups, and the proctor led Sakura's group to a small building in a clearing. This is your starting point, and your ending point. The proctor began to explain. When the bell announces the start of the second stage, you will make your way northwards into the woods. Each team will be given a map of the forest indicating the boundaries of the exam. Within the boundaries are 10 fortresses, guarded by skilled Chiryunin from several of your participating villages. Each fortress has a treasure inside of it. Your goal is to find and make your way to one of these fortresses and retrieve what the shinobi are guarding. Once you have retrieved a treasure, you will make your way back to your original starting point, here. You will have 7 days to complete your task. The use of lethal force will be allowed during this stage. The proctor then smirked, folding his arms as he surveyed the teams in front of him. There will be no further information given to you. It seems simple. Sakura commented quietly. Way too simple. For all we know they've spent months setting up traps and tricks all over these woods. And who knows what we'll expect in those fortresses. 7 days is a long time. Gaara added. The exam boundaries will likely be quite vast. It's risky. There could be bandits or missing nin. If not for the fact that most of the villages are participating, I might even postulate foreign shinobi interference. Though I suppose we are a bit too far north to worry about cloud or mist. Sai noted. Plus, there's the other teams to worry about. This is the phase. Sakura concluded. This is where the enemy wants us. None of the teams in this quadrant were known allies. That meant, right off the bat, they would likely be fighting for survival. Every team would be looking for a chance to take a pot shot at other teams as soon as the phase began, especially since the number of treasures was so small. Only 10, which meant only 10 teams could pass at maximum. There was a chance no team could pass at all, or that a team might try to go for 2 treasures to keep other teams from passing. And then Danzo was going to try and ensure her death, on top of everything else. Sakura was more than a little panicked as the proctor began to hand out maps. The boundaries of the exam stretched for miles, and it seemed unlikely that teams would run into each other at all after the first hour. Yet, this only served to unnerve Sakura more. Finding allied teams in these woods was going to prove a challenge, which meant they would have to deal with the possibility that, whatever Danzo had planned, they would have to face it alone. Danzo had gotten weeks, if not months, to plan this out. Sakura had gotten a day. Where the fuck was Shikamaru when you needed him? but Shikamaru had seemed certain that everything would work out. It was possible the other rookies had plans of their own that she wasn't aware of yet. Too many unknowns. Too many variables. Sakura felt Emi brush against her leg, and she bent down to give the tanuki a couple pats. Well, if she did end up dying out here, at least she'd be with friends and a cute animal, right? She looked to Gaara and Sai, both of whom had a sort of stern, tight look to their faces that was more than indicative of their own stress. 5 quiet, agonizing minutes passed. All of the teams shuffled about into a ready position, weapons at the ready, routes planned. Sakura had opted to just pick a direction and run. Sai could easily help pinpoint their location from the air once they'd gotten far enough from the other teams. For now, all that mattered was survival. A bell rang in the distance. Sakura pushed chakra into her legs and began to run. She noticed, in her peripheral vision, that at least one of the teams didn't bother moving from the starting position at all. It was a gamble. Teams had to return to their starting point in order to pass the exam, which meant that at some point, a team would come back with treasure in hand. A team could theoretically wait and set up an ambush, negating the need to actually take on a fortress. But it depended entirely upon one of the teams from their quadrant managing to take a treasure and return to the spot without dying in the process. Sakura could allow herself to worry about the ambush team later. Right now, that just meant 10 teams that were potentially trying to kill her. She kept her 3-pronged kunai at the ready, deflecting 2 sets of shuriken as she leaped from tree to tree. Gaara and Sai weren't far behind her, but at the speed they were running, Gaara's sand was having trouble keeping up with him, let alone spreading out to cover the others. A quick glance back showed Sakura that Sai had already pulled out a blank scroll and begun to paint, but so far nothing had come out. Was he really wasting his time on something big? From her left, Sakura saw movement, and suddenly an enormous gust of wind pushed its way towards her, sending her into the air. She was prevented from going too far when Gaara's sand wrapped around her ankle, pulling her back to safety, but it wasn't long before more gusts of wind were sent their way. Suna Shinobi, by the look of things, and they seemed hell-bent on their team specifically. There wouldn't be a point to wasting shuriken on them either, the wind gusts would make any projectile moot. That left confronting them directly or getting away, and Sakura was reminded, as a shuriken missed her by inches, that slowing down meant a squabble with potentially 10 other teams. She felt a burst of air behind her, and after wondering briefly if an enemy's attack had just been that inaccurate, something appeared beneath her mid-jump, an enormous black and white bird, one of Sai's ink summons, and it was more than large enough to carry all of them. They swooped beneath to catch Gaara, and even Emi, who had impressively managed to keep up with their sprint, and from their side directed his bird skyward. They burst through the canopy of the forest, and after a couple swerves to avoid more wind gusts and shuriken, they were leaving the enemy teams behind. Son of a bitch. Sakura let herself curse. It's gonna be a damn bloodbath at every gate. I don't know what we would have done without your bird, Sai. Died, probably. Sai answered. Thanks for the vote of confidence. Sakura pulled out the map they had been given and started to look at the forest beneath them. It was easy enough to figure out their surroundings with an aerial view, and at first glance they appeared to be the only team with that advantage. But Sakura remembered Fuse chakra wings, and it was entirely possible that there was another team with an actual bird summon that they might need to worry about. We can't stay up here too long, Sakura concluded. Even a shinobi that climbs high enough will be able to catch sight of us. We should figure out a direction to try and get low to the ground again. Agreed. Sai replied. If Danzo means to see us dead, our only course of action is to ensure those under his influence do not find us. All while passing the exam, Gaara added solemnly. Sakura, are you sure Shikamaru knows what he's doing? Yes. Sakura paused, frowning. Maybe. The other rookies know the situation. If we could find them, we could work together. I doubt there's any team that could take all 9 of us. The question is going to be finding them. Emi can help. Gaara held up the tanuki. She knows what they smell like. That's perfect. Sakura grinned. All right, take us down, Sai. We'll find the other teams and take it from there. By the time they descended into the forest again, the sun had finished setting and it was dark. The trees were alive with the sounds of nighttime creatures, but even some of the larger animals scurried away once they caught wind of Gaara's presence. A benefit to housing Shukaku, Sakura supposed. There wasn't a creature alive that wanted to mess with a Baijuya. Though it was a potential risk, Sakura pulled out a flashlight from a storage scroll. Being able to see was just a smidgen more important than potentially risking discovering if an enemy saw the light. I don't know why shinobi haven't invented a jutsu for night vision. Sakura grumbled quietly as they walked. What do shinobi on missions at night do? Just hope they don't run into a tree. Shinobi use their other senses to move about, fisticuffs. Sai retorted. A talented shinobi can use echolocation to avoid obstacles. Oh, so you know echolocation? Maybe you should take the lead. I never said I knew echolocation. So does that mean you're not a talented shinobi? Maybe not. But that means neither of you are either. Sakura, Gaara spoke up suddenly, and even in the dimness Sakura saw that the boy looked somewhat distressed. Do you mean, you really can't see where we're going? Do you mean you can? I've always been able to see in the dark. Gaara admitted. I thought. Has nobody else ever used a flashlight around you? Sakura had to hold herself back from yelling in disbelief. Kankuro and Tamari just followed me on missions. There was a pause, and Gaara frowned. Shukaku's laughing. Well crap, no point in using this thing, then. Sakura groaned as she put the flashlight away. Put it down in your notes, Sai, I guess Baijuya have night vision. Shukaku's chakra has probably been helping you see in the dark all your life, that is so frickin' useful. If we get out of this alive, I'm gonna make Shukaku teach us how that works. We can invent the night vision jutsu. I imagine it's just enhancing how much natural light your eye can receive and process. Sai postulated. Jinhyuriki might be able to do it naturally due to their symbiosis with the Baijuya. They have larger reserves to begin with, and if the Baijuya themselves process light that way, the Baijuya's chakra might instinctively do so within the host. Sounds like it would take really good chakra control not to blow your eyes out when you do it, though. Sakura tried to remember her brief studies into chakra pathways. There were plenty of chakra nodes in the head, and pathways that specifically moved around the eyes. That sort of jutsu would require molding the chakra in those pathways in a way that enhanced light, without altering the natural flow. But really, wasn't that what she did with her feet when she climbed trees or water walked? It had taken effort at first, but now that she had been doing it for over a year, it happened without thinking. It wasn't just a matter of using a jutsu, it was just training her body to naturally adjust her chakra to dim light. All she needed to know was how. You and Emi should take the lead for now, Gaara. We'll follow behind you. Sakura decided. And if Shukaku has any tips for us to practice while we move? He says you have a better chance of learning echolocation. Sakura held up her middle finger towards Gaara. For Shukaku, not you. They walked well into the night, making their way forward as quickly and quietly as possible. Emi had caught wind of some sort of scent, but it was soon clear that it would take some time to catch up with whomever she'd decided to follow. It was past midnight that the exhaustion of the day began to catch up with Sakura, and even Sai looked as though his eyes were beginning to droop. We should rest. Gaara finally spoke up, coming to a stop. I don't need sleep. I can keep watch. Yeah, and if we stop, that gives others a chance to catch up to us. Sakura countered. It won't matter if you're too tired to stop them. Right. It was a fair point. Sakura hadn't used up too much chakra in their early sprint, but without sleep, she'd just be at a disadvantage. This was a dilemma the other teams would be facing as well, and they didn't have an insomniac Jinhyuriki at their disposal to keep watch. Taking a brief nap now, conserving strength, they were just using their assets to their advantage. Setting up a small camp was easy. Sakura had gotten experience setting up perimeter traps in the last exam, and Sai's artistic eye was able to help blend their little tent with the foliage around it. Sakura set up 2 sleeping bags inside of it, then distributed rations to the boys. From there, Gaara perched himself in one of the boughs of the tree above them, with Emi at his side to help keep watch. Sakura was used to sleeping outside now. She remembered in the previous exam how difficult it had been to sleep on hard ground, but now the earth beneath her felt like a comfortable, firm mattress. She and Sai settled, back to back, and Sakura slowly began to let herself drift to sleep. Sakura. Sakura's eyes flew open, and it took her a minute to realize that it was Sai speaking her name. Sai almost never spoke her name directly, it was always fisticuffs or some other name to reference her. But he had definitely said it. As Sakura sat up, she noticed that Sai had turned around to face her. Yeah. We might be dying soon. Sakura huffed, turning back around and laying down again. Yeah, I know, Sai, I'm trying not to think about it too much. I thought I was ready to die. Sakura looked back again. Sai was gazing forward towards the entrance of the tent, not meeting her eyes as he spoke. I thought I was ready to die for Root. Sai dash. I killed my brother, Sakura. Brother? Sai had never mentioned a brother before, but Sakura was suddenly reminded of the book she had taken from him when they had first met. The book with two shinobi, battling foes until they met and held hands at the very end, at least, that was how Sai had ended it. Could that have been his brother? Root are told to eliminate all attachments. My brother and I, we had gotten close in our training. He let me kill him. He told me to live on, for us. He just ran into my blade. Sai's voice still seemed apathetic as he spoke, but Sakura could see in the darkness that his hands had begun to shake. He was ready to die so that I could live. But I realized, that wasn't really the truth. Not all of it. We could have tried to run. We could have gone to the Hokage and begged to be released from Root. We could have tried to defect. Maybe we would have died, but if we'd lived, we would have had each other. But my brother, he had already given up, then. He didn't think there was another way. Maybe he couldn't live in a world where I had died, but maybe more than that, he couldn't bring himself to live in this world at all. Sakura reached out, putting her hand on top of Sai's. It still shook, but he did not pull away. But I wanted to live. Sai continued. I did as Danzo asked because I wasn't ready to die. For all I swore about protecting Konoha with my last breath, all I was really doing was following orders so that they wouldn't kill me. Living an empty life was better than having no life at all. It hurt to live without my brother, but I couldn't change what he had done. And maybe, at the time, I hadn't wanted to live in a world without him either, but he'd made me promise to live. So I did. I thought I did. But living in fear isn't really living, is it? It wasn't. Sakura couldn't help but agree, but she didn't dare speak up now. This was the most Sai had ever really talked about himself, and she didn't want to stop him now. I think I saw it for the first time when I saw you and Gaara. You both, working together, not because of fear, not because of duty, but because you wanted to. And then you started the Neutrality Pact and, I saw a world where no one had to be afraid. Nobody would have to die for anyone else. I saw it and, I didn't know it then, but I had to reach for that world, or else I might as well have been dead all this time. My brother might have given up, but I didn't have to. Instead of dying for what I was told to die for, I could die for something I believed in. It was the same as you and Gaara, I thought. You're ready to put your life on the line for this. You've already put your life on the line for this. Gaara will never stop putting his life on the line for you. And me, I've finally become like the brother I idolized. I can't go back to the way things were. And I can't let you fail. I can't live in a world where Danzo killed you. So you have to promise me, if I tell you to run and leave me behind dash. I won't. Sakura insisted, squeezing his hand tight to assure him. He'd been joking about it so much, she hadn't realized, or maybe it hadn't been joking at all. Had she just been unable to see it this entire time? That's not going to happen, Sai. You're not going to die out here. We're not going to die, Sai, because we have something to live for. Why do you think I was able to stand up to Ataki? Why do you think I was able to leave my village, run all this way, come this far? It's not about dying for something, Sai, it's about living for it. And I promise you, Sai, as long as I can move, as long as I can draw breath, we are not going to die in this fucking forest, no matter what Danzo throws at us. Sakura, please dash. Maybe I can't live in a world where Danzo killed you either, sigh. Sakura let herself snap, not caring if Gaara heard, not caring if anyone heard. Haven't you put that together yet? You're my friend. We didn't go through all this hell just for you throw your life away. We are making it through together. I'm not gonna die. Gaara is not gonna die. And so help me you're not gonna die or else I'll figure out that stupid jutsu Orochimaru uses to bring the dead back and once I've used it on you I'll really show you some damn fisticuffs. I see. Sai went quiet for a while, though he still had not pulled his hand away. He hadn't yet met her eyes either. But as the seconds passed away, Sakura felt the shaking in his hand begin to stop. I see. He repeated. That feeling, that look in your eyes then. Sakura didn't know what he was talking about, but she felt Sai's other hand reach to cover hers. Living for something. You're right, I don't think I've ever tried that. No one ever speaks of living in the shinobi world. Only dying, and dying well. Living well, I don't think I know how to do that. But if we survive this, if the pact survives, would that be living well, do you think? I think so. Then, as long as we move. As long as we draw breath. Sai's eyes met hers, and Sakura could almost feel a change in the air, as if determination was starting to leak into his chakra, into the very space around them. We stay alive. That's right, Sai. We stay alive. This time, as they drifted off to sleep, Sakura made sure her hand never left his. When the morning came, so too did the enemy. Their presence was announced with a mighty blast as one of Sakura's larger traps was deployed. Sai had stocked up on a plethora of explosive tags, and Sakura had lined up a dozen of them around the perimeter of their tent, along with an intricate web of tripwires disguised under the brush. They were midway into breakfast when it occurred, but each of them dropped their rations in a flash as the explosions sounded around them. Sakura let out a quick sensing pulse, and paled as she realized the number of shinobi that had approached them. 1, 2, 3, 10 total, though the 10th's chakra was so low she barely picked up on it at all. She couldn't help but wonder if her traps had been lethal. 10 was 3 teams plus 1, which would have been an odd grouping. Briefly, Sakura hoped it hadn't been any of the Konoha rookies caught up in the explosion, but Emi's angry growling was more than enough to convince her that it wasn't friends who had approached them. 9 of the shinobi moved forward into the perimeter. The 10th stayed behind, and Sakura's pulses confirmed, after several bursts, that their chakra was fading and fading fast. Dead, likely. Their preparation had turned it from a 4-on-1 scenario to a 3-on-1 scenario. Bad odds, but still better than it had been. They were sporting Konoha headbands, and Sakura noticed that they were all wearing similar dark clothing that vaguely reminded her of Sai's attire. With the exception of one who had taken the front, the shinobi all had blank expressions that definitely were familiar. She had seen that same blankness on Sai when they had first met months ago. Root agents, all of them. Danzo hadn't just persuaded the villages to sick their teams on her, he'd planted his own teams to take her down. It wasn't even about taking the exams. Root agents were supposed to be beyond Chunin level to begin with. Danzo had planted 4 root teams into the exams in the hope of taking her down, and it was only by luck that her traps had managed to eliminate one of them. The front shinobi had put on an expression that was something of a mockery of a smile. It certainly didn't look friendly, in fact, it reminded her of the look on Orochimaru's face as he'd toyed with Sasuke in the Forest of Death. Sadistic, and cold. Terra, she heard Sai whisper. Not bad for a bunch of traitors. The man replied. He pulled out what looked to be 3 senbon at first, but as Sakura stole another glance she realized that they were longer than traditional senbon, and that there were wires attached to the ends. She saw Sai take a step back at the sight of them. Clearly he knew the man and what he could do, and seeing Sai afraid was enough to put her even more on the defensive. Danzo wants to give you a chance to redeem yourself, Sai. Terra spoke. If you kill the Harano girl now, he will welcome you back into Root. And there will only be minor punishment. Sakura and Gaara both looked to Sai then, but in this Sai did not show any signs of wavering. He pulled forth an empty scroll, prepared for a fight. You may tell Danzo to. He looked over to Gaara. How does Shukaku usually say it? Ah. He looked back to Terra, and Sakura saw him put an equally fake smile on his face. "Eat shit and die." Sakura snorted, her fear temporarily abated by the comment. Maybe Sai was wary of the man, but he certainly wasn't going to show it any longer. Sakura readied herself, letting her chakra begin to build. "Well," Terra commented, sounding amused. "How unfortunate for you. And how stupid. You could have avoided all this suffering, but now you'll have to join in." He gave a sharp jerk of his head, and the 8 shinobi behind him leapt forward into action. Sakura was prepared. 3 of the 8 headed for her, another 3 to Gaara, and 2 towards Sai. Terra held back. If she could take him out, Sakura theorized, it might serve to scatter the group. But for now, she had to survive, and while she didn't know what Root were capable of, they didn't know what she was capable of either. She slammed both of her hands downwards, and 5 pillars of earth shot up in front of her. 2 of her attackers dodged, but one wasn't so lucky. It didn't knock him out, but it did send him up into the air, and Sakura was more than happy to take advantage. She shoved chakra towards her feet and ran, just barely missing a sword blow from one of the other shinobi. Another well-placed earth pillar just below her feet helped catapult her into the air, and from there Sakura let gravity take hold of her. As the enemy hit the ground, she twisted in the air, preparing to land a powerful punch while he was downed. However, right before she was due to land the blow, she felt a sharp pain in her arm. 2 shuriken had landed in her flesh, and though her punch still landed, it was with nowhere near the amount of force she had initially planned. She fell to the ground, only just managing to roll herself up and into a kneeling position. The shuriken had gotten in deep, and the shinobi who had thrown them was already preparing more to send her way. Sakura wrenched the shuriken out, not letting herself linger on the pain. With her uninjured arm, she flung them just in time to intercept the enemies. The shinobi she'd punched wasn't unconscious, but was still downed. For now, she wouldn't have to worry about him, which just meant there was 2 more to take care of before. "Sakura!" Sai's voice shattered her concentration, and Sakura glanced wildly around the battlefield until she caught sight of where Sai was looking. Gaara had been surrounded by his 3 attackers, but they weren't attacking him. They'd each pulled out a large scroll and unraveled it, and the glow of the symbols on the paper were enough to confirm that they had already activated whatever jutsu they'd written upon it. And Gaara was glowing? His sand had seemed to freeze in place around him, and as Sakura looked, she could see that the glowing was from a large symbol on Gaara's stomach. She could see lines and kanji that wove in an intricate circle, a seal she realized, the seal that was keeping Shukaku bound within Gaara's flesh. Whatever the shinobi were doing, it had caused Gaara to halt and the seal to glow. One of the 3 pulled out what looked to be a large tea kettle, and in that moment Sakura understood. They were trying to remove Shukaku. Gaara had told her that in the early days of the village's founding, Shukaku had been sealed within a giant tea kettle, before he had ever been sealed within a human host. And of course Tsunagakuer would know the sealing techniques required to pull Shukaku from a host and put him back in his original prison. Suna had made the seals to begin with. And Danzo had ensured Suna's alliance by ensuring that they would have a chance to recover their Baijuyo from his rebellious host. Sakura heard a gut-wrenching scream as the seal started to unravel, and it was at that moment that she also remembered that removing a Baijuyo from its host would kill the host, which meant that unless she did something quickly Gaara was going to die. She turned her back on the enemies in front of her, sending as much chakra as she could to her legs. If she could just get there fast enough, land a good punch on one of them. She felt a stabbing sensation in her shoulder, and all of a sudden her world was pain. It felt like minutes passed before Sakura was able to understand what was happening. Her vision went white, and when she was able to feel something besides pain, she became aware that her entire body seemed to be vibrating intensely. There was a sound, a high-pitched sound that she eventually realized was a scream wrenching itself from her throat. Eventually, the vibrations ceased, and her vision bled back into view. Sakura saw a wire in front of her, and as she forced her head to turn she realized that one of Terra's senbon had lodged itself into her shoulder. "So sorry, Ms. Harano." Terra spoke in a manner that reminded her of a parent admonishing a child. "But there won't be any interfering with the Jinhiriki by you today. Danzo wants you dead, of course, but he told me I didn't have to do it quickly." Sakura saw Terra move a free hand to make a hand sign. His other hand sparked with energy, his chakra building into lightning that suddenly coursed down the wire he was holding, the wire that was attached to the senbon in her shoulder. Once again, Sakura's world became pain. Her body seemed to lock into place, and as much as she longed to yank the senbon from her body, the electric shocks kept her from being able to move so much as a finger. She heard screaming again, and now she wasn't sure if it was her or Gaara. Both. When the shocks stopped, Sakura felt earth on her face. She had fallen over, and before she could even think of getting up again, another shock made its way through her body and all she could feel was pain, pain, pain. You're an earth type, of course. Terra's voice sounded muffled, distant compared to the ringing in her ears. I'm sure my lightning must feel especially good on someone like you. Come now, are you really that weak? I haven't even used all 3 of my needles yet. I wonder if you'll be able to handle 2 of them? I'll let you take a breather. We don't want you to pass out just yet, do we? Sakura couldn't move her arms, but she could still see, still force herself to move. She had to keep moving, she had to keep breathing. Out of the corner of her eyes she saw that 2 shinobi had managed to restrain Sai, holding his arms behind him and forcing him to stay knelt on the ground, forcing him to watch. Sakura realized. Is the traitor having fun yet? Terra looked back to Sai with a malicious sneer. You've grown attached to her, haven't you? You weren't supposed to get attached. Now you get to see why. I think it's time to see if your precious Sakura can handle 2 charges, don't you think? Not 2. She couldn't handle 2. Sakura forced chakra through her body, trying to push something out, get a jutsu to work, force her legs to move, anything. She willed her energy into the ground beneath her, and she saw Terra suddenly dance to the left as a pitiful pillar of earth jutted out next to him. She's still got a bite. Terra stated, looking almost gleeful. That just makes it more fun, doesn't it? He readied a second senbon, and Sakura knew without a doubt that she didn't have the strength to move, let alone dodge. It hit her other shoulder, and there was a second that seemed to last an eternity, that Sakura and Sai's eyes met. She saw him mouth the word no. And then there was pain, 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 pain. Chapter 53. Gaara remembered being warned as a child. You are a weapon. You are a tool. You exist only for this purpose. Shukaku remembered being warned, hours after his creation. There is darkness in humanity, and we may never be free of it. Gaara remembered the promise they made. If you ever lose yourself to the monster, ever turn upon this village, we shall take our power back and you will die. Shukaku remembered the promise they made. We must guide them down the path of peace. Gaara remembered the pain of betrayal. You were never loved. Shukaku remembered the pain of betrayal. Your power is vast. We shall take it for the sake of our village. Black sand whirled around him in a powerful vortex, and Gaara felt his body being ripped in 2. Somewhere in the forefront of his mind, Gaara knew he was in agony, but he had been pulled back into the mind space shared by him and Shukaku, and everything was falling apart. It was as if a wind tunnel was pulling somewhere in the distance, pulling away at the sand, pulling at the chains that held Shukaku down, pulling at Shukaku himself. And yet, Gaara was unmoving, feeling as though the opposite were true and he was being pushed away, torn away. Looks like this is it, brat. Shukaku spoke, looking oddly calm even with the chaos around him. Next to him, a chain snapped, flying away into the whirling void. You had a good run. And out of all of your pathetic race, I think I disliked you the least. Shukaku was being taken from him. Gaara ran forward, pushing against the force that so desperately wanted to keep him away. He reached out, wrapping his arms around the link of one of the remaining chains before it could snap and fly away. He held on with all of his strength, even though his arms threatened to pull out of their sockets, even with the maelstrom that seemed too powerful for one person to fight alone. There's no stopping it. Shukaku told him. Even if the others stop them, the seal is broken. I'm coming out. Don't worry, if I'm not shoved into a kettle, I'll try not to step on your precious Sakura. No. Gaara protested. No, I can't go. Not yet. I told you, brat. Stay with me. Even yelling, Gaara's voice was barely audible above the whirl of the wind, but he knew Shikaka heard. He had to. You have to stay, please. Give them time. They'll find a way. I'll give you kudos for wanting to stay alive, brat, but there comes a time where you need to accept the truth. Sometimes when something breaks, there's no fixing it. You know that's not true. Gaara looked up into the eyes of the Baijiu. In this, Gaara no longer had any doubt. Look me in the eyes and tell me I wasn't broken. Look at me and tell me I wasn't healed. Gaara remembered love. I don't care what happened in the past, you're my friend now, got it? Shikaka remembered. I name you Shikaku, and you shall be the protector of men. The Tanuki shifted his weight, pushing with all his might away from the opening in the seal, back towards where Gaara was so desperately fighting for his life. All right, brat, we give them time. Sai heard Sakura scream, and for the first time he truly understood what others meant when they claimed their heart hurt for another. Tera was the root interrogator. He'd crafted his senbon using techniques from weaponsmithing clans, ensuring that the wiring and the needles would both be able to conduct his chakra at maximum efficiency. It required very little chakra to activate them. Sai had witnessed, once when he was on guard duty, a prisoner undergo Tera's tortures for over 6 hours. They had gotten all the information they needed about 5 hours in, Tera just hadn't wanted to stop. If anyone nearby heard the screaming, they would likely be smart and keep their distance. There was no way to call for help. There was no one that would come. And Tera would be more than happy to keep going until Sakura was unable. And here he was, arms wrenched behind him, a kunai dug into his shoulder to keep him from moving too much. The woman holding him was all too happy to dig in the blade and remind him to keep still. Even counting the man that Sakura had downed, there were still 4 shinobi between him and Sakura. Counting the 3 currently working with scrolls, 7 between him and Gaara. Sai wasn't an idiot, he couldn't beat those odds. He'd told them time and time again how this would end and they'd never listened. Tera was saying something to him, something about a lesson he should have learned. Sakura wasn't screaming anymore with Tera distracted, but it was only a matter of time. Sai saw her hand twitch, saw her legs shift. Even after all that, even after feeling the bite of 2 bolts, Sakura was still trying to move. As long as we move. Tera noticed the movement and turned to watch, laughing as he watched Sakura tremble. There's no point in trying to get up, traitor. I'll just knock you on your ass again. Might as well just stay down and behave yourself. Tera readied his hand sign, and once again Sai and Sakura's eyes met. As long as we can still draw breath. But those weren't the eyes of someone who had given up. Even with no hope in sight, even with no chance of getting out of here unscathed, Sakura wasn't giving up. We stay alive. Sai found energy he didn't know he had, he found chakra surging through his veins, and all at once he leapt upwards, slamming the top of his head against the chin of the shinobi on his right. There was no more pain in his shoulder from the blade, either it had fallen out or straight up didn't hurt anymore. He twisted his right arm, yanking it roughly from the grasp of his captor just in time to land a blow on the left shinobi. Something about the movement didn't seem right, but his mind didn't register pain, only movement, only staying alive. They had taken his blades, but root shinobi were taught to adapt, and as the right shinobi recovered from Sai's headbutt, he turned just in time to be on the receiving end of the wooden butt of Sai's paintbrush. Always aim for the fleshy bits, his brother had told him, and Sai took that to heart as he thrust true, into the eye, past the eye. 1 down. They'd disarmed him of his ink, shattering his main vial onto the ground so that there was no hope of him using it. Sai had stored spares within scrolls, of course, but there wasn't time to grab a scroll as his remaining captor and the other 2 unoccupied shinobi all came for him at once. His ink was chakra infused, that was how his drawings came to life so quickly. No need to waste time expending chakra if you had spent it in the past, and of course that left more for you to use in the moment if needed. But there was something else that Sai could use that was naturally infused with his chakra. His hand flew up to grasp at his injured shoulder, and in the heat of the moment Sai realized that now was going to be the time that he would finally answer his long-pondered question of whether or not blood could make his art come to life. He had no time to find a blank canvas, so instead his fingers ran across his arm, and he felt the burn of his chakra as two red birds sprang out. They attacked the nearest assailant as vicious as his intent. Question answered. 2 down. The remaining 2 were still bearing down upon him, but Sai ignored them both as he raced forwards towards Terra. All he needed to do was distract him. All he needed to do was give Sakura time. He let himself slam into Terra's side before grabbing on and holding on. He felt the impact of hitting the ground and heard Terra curse. Sai held Terra down until the other 2 shinobi drove blades into his back. He felt his arms weaken, and he could hear the sound of his pulse throbbing in his ears. But he could still move. But he could still breathe. But he was still alive. I'll admit, it's going to be a shame to lose someone like you, he heard Terra say as he pushed Sai away. Using your own blood for your seals was a bold move. Danzo will miss that ability. Sai fell onto his side. He was starting to feel pain now, a deep pain in his back from the blades that adrenaline and will just couldn't ignore any longer. Still, he managed to spit at Terra's feet. I'm not Danzo's anymore. No, Terra agreed. Now you will just be dead. Sai looked up and saw Terra turning to face Sakura again, readying his third and final Senbon. But first you will watch her die. Pain. A heartbeat. A glimpse of trees and sun. Sai, in the distance, their eyes meeting. Pain. Gaara, his body stuck in paralyzed agony as the seal on his chest was ripped apart. Pain. And then she was surrounded by black sands, grasping onto a dark chain, willing him to stay. We've got to stay alive. Pain. But the pain was different now, and she was trying to move. As long as we move, as long as we breathe, we stay alive. And the pain was like a heartbeat now, a pulse that echoed and throbbed through her body until the feeling was so intense that she felt nothing at all, nothing but emptiness and black space around her. She was biting down on the arm of the sound shinobi, ignoring the fist pounding against her head because all that mattered was keeping her team safe. All that mattered was that nobody touched Sasuke or Naruto again. But no. The pulse wasn't a heartbeat, wasn't the steady 1-2 rhythm that she had been taught in basic first aid. This pulse was more like steady thunder, rippling through her body and through the earth beneath her and through the trees and grass and stones and everything. And she was walking through tall grass as the sun beat down upon her head, and she was angry. She stomped her way through the brush towards the man in the distance, an older fellow who wore a headband with a symbol that looked vaguely familiar, but she could not quite place her finger on where she had seen it before. What's the meaning of this, old man? She demanded, and the man, Genkei, stood up tall to meet her. He had been gathering herbs by the look of things, his wicker basket full of flowers and stalks. Why the fuck won't you let me become a Chiryunin? Language, boy. Genkei lectured. I don't know where you got that mouth, but it won't help your cause. You are not yet ready. And even if you were, there may not be a point to establishing rank in this village for much longer. What does that even mean? Oh Haiden. That wasn't her name, Sakura thought to herself, and she heard the pulsing of the world around her again, felt it in her bones, beneath her skin, but she couldn't tear herself away from the vision. You are not yet ready, boy. Another man was lecturing her now, and instead of grass Sakura saw a deep cavern, lit only by candlelight, and the man in front of her was old, so old she could scarcely believe the man was still capable of standing. You do not yet understand the meaning of the connection you have been given. What is there to understand? I'm immortal. She grinned a wide, cocky grin. Your god thought I was so cool that he just had to give me a power-up. It is not just immortality you have been given. You have been given a powerful gift, and you must understand its significance before you may learn more of our rituals. Yeah, sure, I'll listen to your lecture. You won't just listen. You will experience. Suddenly Sakura felt a sharp pain in her wrist, and the scene had changed and she was sitting in front of the old man in a different room. He had drawn the blade of the kunao along her wrist, and as he did so his own wrist cut open. Ow! She cursed. Son of a bitch. Hurts, does it not? Of course it fucking hurts. Why the hell would I ever hurt myself just to hurt somebody else? This is stupid as shit. And it is necessary. How can you hope to understand the levity of your actions if you do not fully experience the consequences it brings? How can you hope to comprehend the weight of taking a life if you do not understand what it is like to lose your own? All creatures feel pain, and we of this path understand pain more deeply than any other on this continent. We do not strike unless we are willing to strike ourselves. We do not fight unless we are prepared to shoulder the weight of that commitment. But when we have steeled ourselves truly, we become the masters of death. That is the way of the Hagashusai. Masters of death, huh? She looked down at her arm, and saw that the wound was still bleeding, though she could move her hand as though nothing had happened. Yes. And through this understanding you will find joy in the connection. The pain you share is a sign that you have reached that true bliss of comprehension, that which your enemy experiences. Those who cause pain without understanding the power they wield, Jashin always collects his debts, and that pain will be thrust upon them tenfold, in this life or the next. Well, that just sounds fucking awesome. Your enthusiasm will serve you well. As his chosen, you shall be a revenant upon the world. Where there is pain, you shall bring justice. Where there is ignorance, you shall bring understanding. Justice. Justice. Always collects his debts. Air hit her lungs, and the pulsing of the world became pain once again. Sakura's body had locked up under the influence of the lightning, her nerves misfiring and seizing up until she had been left a curled ball in the dirt. She tried desperately to move, but nothing would respond. She flared her chakra, and she felt it ripple beneath her skin, and as it made its way to her fingers she saw her hand twitch. Something was happening, she realized. The man was no longer sending out pain lightning. She didn't know how long the moment would last. Sakura continued to force chakra through her body, down into her fingers and toes, forcing the energy to pulse in that same, steady rhythm that had been beating into her mind as she'd seen through someone else's eyes. She focused on matching that rhythm, and as she did she felt the pulsing around her start up again. For a second, a minute, an hour, she could not tell, Sakura held perfectly still and let her chakra flow through her. Let all the chakra flow through her. Something within her snapped, and Sakura could move again. She heard a whistle sound in the air, and in response she shot up to her feet. She turned to face her opponent and saw the last of his senbon flying through the air at her, and it was so slow it was laughable. But the man was confident in his abilities. He had already begun to raise his free hand up to make a hand sign, and lightning chakra was beginning to spark at the end of the 3 wires connecting him to his needles. Sakura allowed herself to simply pluck the needle out of the air with one hand. With the other, she removed the 2 that were still in her shoulders. Time still felt achingly slow. She could see the chakra begin to make its way down the wires. Those who cause pain without understanding the power it wields. Sakura let her arms move in one fluid motion, throwing the senbon back towards Terra. All 3 hit true, landing directly in his chest. Time sped up again, and the lightning continued to travel through the wires to its natural conclusion. Jashin always collects his debts. And this time it was her opponent who screamed. Sakura fell to her knees, and the weight of her body suddenly seemed to double, and all she could feel was that pulsing again, only this time the rhythm was off. Her chakra wasn't beating in time with the world again. Her body felt like it was moving through mud, slowing down, crackling and freezing into place, like she was turning into stone somehow. She let herself stop, focused on the rhythm again, this time pushing the chakra out of her, away. She felt her lungs expand with air again, and with a sudden snap, the pulsing stopped, and the world moved at its normal pace once again. Sakura saw Sai on the ground in front of her, 2 long swords stuck into his back. She saw Gaara in the distance, still surrounded by enemies. She saw Emi trying in vain to pull one of the 3 sealers away, only to be knocked back by a fist. And in front of her were still 2 more enemies, who were now overcoming the shock of their leader being defeated and were drawing their swords from Sai's back. Sakura felt a drop of rain. Then there was a hurricane in front of her, a maelstrom of wind and water slamming against her foes and sending them spiraling back into the depths of the forest. 3 shinobi landed in view, each wearing a headband with 4 vertical lines. A Megakure, Sakura realized, and they had come to help. Oof. Bad timing. One of them commented. They're still alive. Another replied. God will forgive us. This one's barely breathing. The first nudged at Sai with his shoe, and Sakura stood up then, not willing to let anyone treat her teammate like that. She staggered forward, drawing her kunai from its hilt, until the third shinobi stepped forward and placed her hand over Sakura's own. Lay down your weapon. Amiha knows healing. The girl looked Sakura up and down, raising an eyebrow as she noted Sakura's shoulders. I'm surprised you're still standing. I was wondering what our angel saw in you. Angel? Sakura's thoughts reeled. You're talking about, Lady Konan. Well, looks like your brain isn't too fried either. Good. We still have a fight to get through. The girl reached out and knocked her knuckles against Sakura's forehead. You can still fight, yeah? Yes. Sakura nodded. Yes, I have to. Right. Leave pretty boy over there to Amiha. Sammy Dare, come on, we need to stop whatever the hell those three are doing with the scrolls. Yeah, that looks pretty nasty. The sole boy of the group came to stand with them, wielding a fan in each hand. Sakura was reminded of Tamari's weapon, but these were much smaller. We can't just blow them away, Urin. Not without hitting the boy in the middle. Come on, he'd live. We need to stop them from completing the jutsu on those scrolls. Sakura insisted. If we don't, my teammate will die. She swallowed. It was probably public knowledge at this point, so she didn't feel bad mentioning it now. He's a Jinhuriki. Ah, shit. Sammy Dare cursed. Can't wait to deal with the fucking Baijuya once the seal breaks. What the hell were these guys thinking? I think they were planning on sealing it in the kettle. Urin answered. Does the Baijuya come out if someone accidentally kicks the kettle over? That also seems pretty stupid. Lady Konan was right, these heathens have been breathing in too much dry air. I can fix it. Sakura's heart skipped with a beat of relief as she heard Sai's voice. The girl Amiha was still kneeling behind him, green chakra flowing from her palm as she worked on the wounds on Sai's back. I can fix it. Sai said again. It's a seal, I know seals. It's a Jinhuriki seal, Sai. Sakura countered gently. I don't think it's supposed to be common knowledge, how those work. Shikaka was always saying it was sloppy to begin with. I'll make a better one. Sai dash. I make a better one, or he dies, Sakura. Either way, I need the chance. It was a long shot. Such a long shot that Sakura couldn't help but think, deep down, that she knew there was no chance of it working. But Sai was right. They fixed it, or they lost Gaara. They just needed a chance. She looked towards the AIM shinobi. You're with us. It is God's will. Urin replied. And I'd rather not be squashed under a chakra being's ass tonight. Sammy Dare added. It was good enough for her. Sakura readied her kunai and let her chakra flow once more. The pulsing was gone, but as they charged into the fray, Sakura did not notice. What had been 9 versus 3 became 5 versus 5. The two shinobi that had been swept away by the AIM maelstrom recovered quickly enough, and with Sakura and himself as wounded and exhausted as they were, Sai realized that it was down to the AIM team to keep them alive. His wounds had been healed, for the most part, but there was still deep damage that Amiha had not been able to reach, and even a basic attack drudged up pain. It became more difficult still once the 3 shinobi on Gaara had been pulled into the skirmish, and now that they were no longer focused on siphoning Shukaku into their kettle, all 10 shinobi had to deal with the sudden outward burst of Baijuyu energy coming from the breach in Gaara's seal. But, it wasn't completely broken yet. It was like Shukaku was holding on somehow, fighting against the seal's breach, and Sai wondered briefly if the old Tanuki had gone and gotten so attached to his host that he was working to save Gaara's life. It was inevitable unless the seal was fixed, but Shukaku was buying them time, and they needed all the time they could get. All he needed was an opening, and as the skirmish continued Sai managed to slip past the enemy and skid to a halt in front of Gaara. The energy was almost overwhelming, and Sai could feel the chakra starting to whip and burn at his skin the closer he got. He pulled out a scroll and summoned his spare ink and brush, and now he was focused with one of the most difficult questions he'd ever had to answer: how do you seal a Jinhuriki? He could see kanji around the breached seal, and certain patterns of lines that were attempting to focus Shukaku's energy to fuse with Gaara's, but the pattern was shoddy. Instead of integrating the energy seamlessly, the energy was being forced into places that didn't make sense. Too much chakra to the upper head coils, Too many slipshod restraining kanji, and now Sai understood, this wasn't just one seal, this was one seal with additions, as if Suna had been trying to edit their own work over the years instead of trying to start a new seal from scratch. Gaara's seal didn't function properly because it might as well have been several seals all fighting with each other for dominance. So the real question was, what should the seal have been to begin with? Harmony, Sai answered all at once. A harmony between Jinhiriki and Baijiu, their energies working together as one. And then Sai knew what the seal had to be. He had learned early on in his experimentation that a picture said more than 1,000 kanji could ever hope to express. The problem with larger seals like Gaara's was that they became too complex, tried to say too much without thinking about the grander implications of what was being said. A seal for a Jinhiriki needed to be simple, but overarching. Something that could mean everything, all at once, or in parts. Gaara! Sai called out, hoping against hope that he could hear him over the rush of the Baijiu's energy breaking out. If you or Shukaku can hear me, I need you to focus on working together as one. He saw Gaara's head turn towards him slightly, and though there didn't appear to be any sort of recognition in his eyes, the turn had to mean something. It was now or never. Sai began to paint a symbol onto his hand. A circle, divided into two equal parts, one dark and one light. Yin and Yang chakra were considered to be chakra's most basic forms, spiritual and physical energy incarnate. All jutsu used either Yin or Yang chakra in some way or another, and it was theorized that the Sage of Six Paths himself could harness a perfect combination of both, a balanced harmony that led to the creation of jutsu itself. Whether or not one believed in the Sage, the symbol of Yin and Yang chakra in harmony was well known within all shinobi countries, and really it was the intent that mattered most. Sai channeled chakra into his hand, and thrust it forward towards Gaara's stomach, over the seal that was now truly beginning to shatter. He felt his chakra begin to violently pull itself from his body, far more than he had ever intended to use, but he did not try to stop it, couldn't stop it even if he'd wanted to. Stay alive, Sai thought to himself. We have to stay alive. Gaara remembered love. Shukaku remembered love. And now, instead of a vortex pulling them apart, the air swirled and churned and began to crash them together. The last thing that Gaara saw before the black sands faded from view was Shukaku, who looked equal parts confused and relieved. Then Gaara opened his eyes and felt chakra. He'd felt this chakra before, in times when he'd allowed Shukaku's malice to leak through and manifest in the sand that always surrounded him, but this time there was no malice, there was no hatred or bloodlust, but instead a strange sort of elation. That kid is the ballsiest son of a bitch I've ever met in my life. Shukaku's voice didn't bleed into his thoughts, but instead seemed like his own thoughts had simply taken on a mind of their own. Not forced, but allowed in. I don't think he realizes the implications of what he's done, but... Gaara looked downwards, at first looking towards Sai, whose skin was cut and bleeding from the force of the chakra that had been expelled out from the seal. He looked haggard and weary, but there was undoubtedly a smile on the boy's face. And then Gaara noticed his own body, his own hands, his own skin that was glowing with an energy that shone with a pleasant hazel hue. Well, I'm not going to complain about the new living conditions. In the back of his mind's eye, Gaara saw Shukaku, freed of his chains, resting casually upon a dune. The sand's grains were now black and white, and for the first time since Gaara had started conversing with the beast, Shukaku looked pleased. The clang of metal jolted Gaara from his thoughts, and he saw Sakura fighting beyond them, alongside 3 shinobi that he did not recognize. But there were 5 he did recognize, the enemy, and now that Shukaku wasn't forcibly being ripped from him, that meant it was his turn to fight. He had to protect Sakura, to keep her safe. Shukaku, the voice I heard. He named you the protector of men. Yeah. Maybe it's time for me to start living up to his expectations again. Who was he? Another time, brat. Right now. Gaara felt chakra stir up within him, and as he spoke he felt a deep rumble in his chest that spurred him into action. Let's kick some ass. Chapter 54. In the rush of the battle and the desperate urge to keep the enemy away from her team, Sakura didn't see Gaara until he materialized in the middle of them. The movement was so quick that her eyes took a moment to process it, and at first Sakura could only dumbly wonder if somehow Gaara had picked up a space-time ninjutsu in the time since the fight began. But something was different about him now, and Sakura realized that she could practically see the chakra oozing off of the boy, hovering about him and giving him a strange hazel hue. About a heartbeat behind him, his sand began to seep into the fray. His sand was quick, but apparently not as quick as the power he'd gotten from whatever Sai had done, Sakura realized. The seal wasn't leaking anymore. Gaara was alive, and somehow everything was different. The fighting came to a halt as everyone reacted to Gaara's sudden presence, but Gaara did not hesitate. He settled, moving his body into a strange stance that Sakura had seen him practicing sometimes in the evening. He'd told her, when she'd asked, that Shukaku had been attempting to teach him taijutsu, but when she'd first seen it she could only think that the stances were funny and the movements somewhat strange. Now as Gaara took the stance, Sakura realized exactly what the style was meant for. His legs bent in a way that reminded her of an hourglass, which served to steady him into the ground beneath him. His hands began to move in circular motions, and in response the sand around him swirled and churned and flew effortlessly around them. The enemy charged, hesitation over, but Gaara responded quicker. Where the motions were once calm and fluid, suddenly Gaara's form became rooted and powerful. With big, sweeping motions of his arms, the sand moved to both protect them from assault and retaliate. Grains wrapped around arms and ankles, pulling enemy shinobi towards him so that he could land powerful punches, which were no doubt reinforced by whatever chakra was now covering him like a blanket. The precision in which Gaara landed the hits was astounding. There was no effort wasted, and one by one the enemy fell to the ground, bloodied, bruised, definitely out of commission if they hadn't outright been killed by the sheer force of Gaara's blows. As the final shinobi charged, Gaara did not even look their way. He reached out a hand, and the chakra around it seemed to mold into the shape of a claw, a somewhat familiar claw. Sakura was reminded of when she'd first known him, when he'd first allowed Shukaku to take possession of his body, but this time the claw did not reach with the intent to kill, rip, or tear. It simply grabbed hold of the enemy while they were in the air, then slammed the shinobi down in a manner that was strangely gentle. The shinobi was still conscious, and it was clearly intentional as Gaara walked closer to examine him. "Go back to Danzo." Gaara spoke, his voice harboring a strange rumble. "Tell him to watch his back." He let the shinobi go, his chakra aura starting to fade and with it the chakric claw that had been holding the man down. There was no hesitation, the shinobi ran off, and with that the battle was ended. Sakura didn't take her eyes off of Gaara. All that had happened in seconds, and Sakura had only one thought on her mind as she took it all in. That was so cool. Their eyes met, and there was palpable relief between the two of them as it settled in that both of them were still alive. But, almost simultaneously, their thoughts turned to the other member of their team, and they ran to Sai's side immediately. Though his external injuries had been healed, Sai looked haggard, and Sakura had now learned to recognize symptoms that had once been present in herself, chakra exhaustion, and it was bad. She'd already gotten the lecture from Kakashi about how chakra drain could kill a person, but now that it wasn't her life at stake, suddenly the weight of the concept became abundantly clear. Sai had expended almost all of his chakra fixing Gaara's seal, and he might die from it. "Live," Sakura's voice was barely a whisper as she clung to the boy's hand. "You promised me. You have to live." For a moment, Sai's lips moved as if he was trying to respond. His eyes shut before anything could come out, and though Sakura's heart stopped for a brief moment, Sai continued to breathe. Sakura sent out a pulse of her sensing jutsu, and though it was incredibly faint, she could still pick up traces of chakra in his body. Alive, he was still alive, but who knew when he would wake up again? She allowed herself to grip his hand tighter. He was wrong. Gaara spoke. "We're all still alive. For now." Sakura agreed. "But who knows how many more teams Danzo's prepared to send after us? Or even just how many teams will try to take out their competition if they pass us by. We can keep us safe." Gaara insisted. "Something is different. Shukaku's chakra, it's no longer running against my own. It's running with." And Shukaku, Gaara looked downwards towards his stomach, and Sakura could still see a faint glow around where Sai had renewed the seal. "Something's different," he repeated. "But it's not bad." "Not bad. Okay. We can work with that." Sakura nodded, reaching out her free hand to squeeze Gaara's as well. "We're alive, you're right about that. Now we just have to worry about passing." "Yeah, that." With Sai unconscious, they were hindered. It might be possible for her and Gaara to take on an exam fortress together, but not without leaving Sai unattended. And they certainly wouldn't allow either of them to go it alone, not after what had just happened. Sakura sighed. "We have 6 days. It's a gamble, but we have to give ourselves time to rest. If Sai wakes up within the next 24 hours, we can go from there." It was all they could allow themselves. Time that, minutes ago, she wasn't sure they'd ever have again. Alive. They were alive. And now, all they had to do was figure out some way to pass and they would be safe, so long as Danzo abided by the laws of the village. It was unlikely that would last, what with Danzo clearly manipulating villages against her, but he had clearly expected her to die in these woods before he made his move. If they didn't die, that would throw him off rhythm. Shikamaru knew there would be an attack, and he trusted in us to survive it. I don't think he knew the extent of what Danzo had planned, but he was under the impression that if we did survive, we'd have something we could use. But what? It came to Sakura all at once. She stood up, rushing to gather up the large scrolls that had been used to try and break Shukaku from its seal. "Grab that old tea kettle," she told Gaara. "I think I've figured it out." She reached for a second scroll, only to be stopped by the foot of an AIM shinobi landing on it. "Hey." The boy, Sammy Dare, spoke up. "You're wounded to shit, we saw what that guy was doing to you. Think you wanna calm down for a hot minute before you start running about again? If you pass out, that's just going to be trouble for us." "Wounded?" Sakura hadn't even noticed any pain, but as Sammy Dare reminded her of it, she began to feel a dull ache in both of her shoulders, and a tingling sensation that resonated through her whole body. She'd been electrocuted, multiple times, which would likely have caused damage to her nerves, not to mention potential burns on her wounds. "Let Amaha tend to your injuries." Yurin spoke, reaching down to pick up the third scroll that Sakura had yet to grab. "We'll gather these things for you. It is God's will that you remain safe. Until your companion awakens, we will be at your side." "Thank you." Sakura bowed her head low. "We owe you a debt for today. You will pay your debt in time." Yurin replied. "God will ensure it." It was easy with their tents already set up to move Sai to a covered space. From there, Sakura was made to sit down, and the girl Amaha began to work her healing jutsu on her wounds. The girl had a feather-light touch that made Sakura shiver, and while it had a slightly different sheen to the mystic palm technique she had seen Konoha medics use, it was still very effective. The other 2 AIM shinobi had gone to dispose of the bodies of the enemies that had been left from the fight. Gaara had remained outside to keep watch. That meant Sakura and Amaha were alone, for the moment, and Sakura decided to take advantage of the time to ask questions. "Your teammates keep mentioning God," Sakura began. "It's not the first time someone has mentioned their God to me, but I admit I didn't really know that AIM had a prominent religion. It is a new religion." Amaha explains. "God came to us a little over a decade ago. I do not remember when it happened, as I was very young then. But God freed us of a cruel leader, and through his actions brought our country to safety and prosperity." "So you've seen your God?" "Yes. It is not often. Usually he speaks through the Lady Konan, his angel. But when it is necessary, he has appeared before us and spoken. I have seen him twice in my lifetime." "Twice?" Sakura let herself mull over this. "You know, most people can't claim to have ever met a god. You'll forgive me for asking this, but you seem very certain that this is a deity and not just a really strong shinobi." "You doubt?" Amaha concluded. "It is natural. You have not seen God as we have. Those who meet him are convinced of his power. And one day you will meet him and understand." "You're so certain of this. You're working to unite the shinobi world. Whether this is God's will or not, he will no doubt come to you in time. He would not have ordered us to protect you simply to allow you to escape his influence. So whomever this AIM god was, he had ordered Sakura's safety. Konan had promised that she would not move against Sakura in tandem with Danzo, but at the time she had not promised help either. That AIM had pulled through for her in this particularly needful time brought a smile to Sakura's face. Maybe there was hope to bring AIM into the treaty after all. I think I would like to meet your god. If only to thank him for ordering you to interfere. If you hadn't stepped in, we would have been in serious hot water, that much is true. Are you not worried about passing the exam? The exam means nothing to us. Our promotion is in God's hands. We came to Konoha simply to accompany the angel and witness what it was you were working on. Participating in these exams is a formality. Yamaha prodded gently at Sakura's back, and Sakura realized she was trying to see if there were any other wounds she had missed. Though that does not mean we will not give it our best effort, once we are assured our work here is done. Oh. Well, again, I owe you quite a bit of thanks. As Yamaha finished, Sakura moved both of her arms, feeling a distinct lack of pain after the medic's work. I won't forget what your team has done for us. And I don't think my shoulders have ever felt better. Your gratitude is unnecessary. God's will has been done. Though Sakura noticed that Yamaha turned slightly pink at the praise. But I cannot help but be curious in turn. You mentioned gods other than my own. Oh. Yeah, I suppose I did. Sakura reached up to fiddle with her necklace. A man I met gave me this. She explained. He spoke of his god, Jashin. His god is one of pain, but, not just causing it, understanding it. Understanding each other. I don't really know a whole lot. We spoke for maybe 10 minutes about it at most. But I couldn't help but feel, well, understanding the pain of others is something I strive to do. That's partially how this pact began. I want to bring people together. I want to stop pain and war and struggle and tragedy. But I don't think I can do that unless I understand where everything began. You're taking on Konoha's shadow. Yamaha confirmed. The one who leads the shinobi who attacked you. The one whom Lady Konan mistrusts. Bingo. You're digging into a deep wound. If that wound has bled out into even my own country, I cannot imagine how deep it has spread here in Leaf. Far too deep for my liking, that's for certain. Sakura looked to Sai, who was sleeping peacefully. Sai here was once a part of Root. When we first met him, he wasn't really a person. He was like a shell of something. Like Root had tried to empty out everything that made him human. I can't let them do that to anyone else. I can't let them do that to Konoha. You have felt the pain of your companion. And thus understand the pain seated within this country. Yamaha smiled. I see. It is little wonder God has turned his eye upon you. I am glad that we interfered today, Sakura Harano. Your actions can only mean good things for my country. Sakura smiled in turn. I will have to come and visit AIM at some point. When I do, hopefully the world will be one step closer to unity. It was a quiet morning from there on out. Occasionally Sakura heard strange sounds in the distance that she could chalk up as skirmishes, perhaps even explosions from tags or jutsu, but it was nowhere near close enough to cause them worry. It was around noon, just as they were beginning to cook some freshly caught fish for lunch, that friends arrived. Naruto reached the area first, shrouded in a faint red outline of chakra, and looked panicked until he caught sight of Sakura. He ran over to Sakura with a cry of relief, pulling her into a tight hug that threatened to crack her spine. I felt that weird chakra flare up and it reminded me of when Shukaku got let out. I thought you might be hurt. We're a little worse for wear, but we're alive, Naruto. Did you leave Ino and Chuji behind? Naruto pulled back, rubbing the back of his head sheepishly. I guess I did. But they were worried about you too, they shouldn't be far behind. Idiot. Sakura gently thwopped the top of Naruto's head. Go back and get your team before something happens to them. We've got the AIM team with us, we'll be fine until all of you are here. Right, I'm going. When Naruto returned the second time, Ino and Chuji were in tow, breathing deep, heaving breaths as they fell over in front of Sakura's tent. Sakura, I need you to tell me how you kept up with this monster. Ino groaned. I don't think my lungs have burned this much in my life. I didn't. Sakura answered honestly. Naruto's just got way too much stamina. I said I was sorry. Naruto whined. But if Sakura was in danger, I needed to get there right away. Shikamaru said we needed to look after her in the exam. Yeah, and just our luck we ended up on the other side of the dim woods. Food, Choji mumbled, crawling his way towards the nearby fire. Gotta have food. Get your own. Samidare called out, pulling his roasted fish out of Choji's reach. It took me an hour to find these. The two boys began to scuffle over the fish, but there was something about the scenario that just brought a smile to Sakura's face. Now that Team 10 was here, she felt a weight lift itself from her shoulders. She was with friends. She would be safe. It was another 2 hours before Team 8 arrived as well, led there by a combination of Akamaru's keen nose and Hinata's Byakugan. Both teams were under similar orders from Shikamaru, it seemed, to rendezvous with Sakura's group and keep each other safe. A little late for Danzo's assault, unfortunately, but their presence would dissuade further attacks, and it allowed the AIM group the peace of mind to leave Sakura in the hands of friends. As evening began to settle in, the Konoha rookies began to plan. If there are any more shinobi under Danzo, they likely won't be as effective against us again. Sakura began to explain. Trying to undo Gaara's seal is something that is only going to have worked the one time. Sai made a brand new seal, so even if they try again, their scrolls won't have any effect on us. The only thing Danzo can hope for now is for somebody to straight up kill us, which isn't going to be likely if the 9 of us stick together and cover each other's back. This is not the only advantage being afforded to us. What else, you might ask? If the 9 of us work together, none of the exam fortresses will be able to withstand our effort. Shino added. Hinata spotted 4 fortresses on our journey over, and I have tagged the location with my beetles. Tomorrow, we can return to these locations and attempt to retrieve the treasures we need to pass. And if we see any teams, Hinata can check if they've already gotten their treasures. Kiba reached over to nudge his teammate. If it's 9-on-3, we can easily take out our opponents and claim the prize for us. Make that 8 instead of 9. Sakura insisted. Even if Sai wakes up, he won't be in good shape after using so much chakra on Gaara's seal. On the off chance there's another preliminary tournament to go through after this phase of the exam, we need to make sure he's in top shape to fight. Here's a thought. We can keep this set up for a base. Ino put forward. Every time we get a treasure, we can return here and have a couple of us stay behind to look after them. That way we don't have to move Sai yet either, he can sit and recover while we do the heavy lifting. I could stay behind. Gaara offered. But, that means. If these guys can't keep me safe, Gaara, nobody can. Sakura cut Gaara off before he could protest further. You're the best of us here at defense, and with Emi around you'll be able to pick out enemies coming before they even see the tent. Emi let out a small bark of what could only be agreement. She had been playing with Akamaru nearby, but Sakura couldn't help but notice that the little tanuki always seemed to be listening in. There was more to the animal than met the eye. From there, the plan was simple. Sakura would move out alongside the other 2 teams in the cover of darkness to the closest fortresses. They would return each time a treasure was retrieved to hide it within the safety of their disguised tent, under Gaara's watch. Once they had 3 treasures, all 9 of them would return to the border, then go their separate ways to return to their starting locations. As night hit and they made their way into the woods, Sakura realized that this exam had its flaws, in that it was entirely dependent on teams not working together. They ran across one enemy team in the darkness, and even 7 against 3 was enough of an advantage to take the poor team down within a matter of minutes. On top of that, the team had already gotten a treasure, which meant that they were now up 1 and had 1 less fortress to try and infiltrate. It was curious, Sakura thought to herself. It was so ingrained within shinobi culture to only trust one's own team, to not reach out towards others. The odds were stacked against teamwork, of course, but even if every team had doubled up with another, it still meant a better chance of taking a treasure and keeping it. This was the mentality that she was fighting against with the Neutrality Pact. Shinobi had been trained to work against each other. Sakura had to show them that working with each other was the true way to go. By the dawn of the 3rd day, the Konoha rookies had retrieved 3 treasures, and by then Sai had finally awakened. His chakra reserves were still near empty, and even Chuji's food pills were not quite enough to bring him to fighting capacity. Despite this, Sai looked more content than Sakura had ever seen him. "We're alive," he kept saying, smiling genuinely as he looked towards her and Gaara. "Yup," Sakura would always reply in turn. "We're still kicking." There were still 4 days left in the exam, which meant they could technically try to allow themselves rest to give Sai time to recuperate, but that just meant the potential for enemy teams to find them and attempt to take their stash. In the end, they decided that it wasn't worth the risk. Sai was too tired to run with the group, but the problem was solved quickly when Gaara pulled the boy up onto his back and wordlessly insisted upon carrying him. Sai unusually did not protest at the treatment, perhaps too exhausted for his usual snark. They came to blows with 2 enemy teams on the way out, but there were very few teams that could stand up to the might of Tujin Hiraki, as well as the heirs to several of the most prominent clans in Konoha. By the evening of the 3rd day, the Konoha rookies had reached the border, and after one final med dash, Sakura and her team had returned to the small wooden building where their exam had begun. Treasure retrieved. 2nd exam completed. They were alive, and now, more important than the exam, they had the evidence they needed to finally start bringing down Root. Sakura had stored the seals she'd retrieved from the Root shinobi, as well as soon as old tea kettle. Not enough to challenge Danzo on its own, and even with what she and Shikamaru had collected, it would still take a small miracle for everything to come together. But, Sakura thought as she touched her necklace, miracles were starting to become less and less unlikely. Those who passed the 2nd exam early were taken to a building back within Konoha's walls, a large hotel where they were given rooms to rest and recuperate until the exam's time frame was over. It was a relief to allow herself to pass out on a soft hotel bed, and she and Sai both slept for about half a day now that they no longer had to worry about enemy shinobi. Sakura was the first of the 2 to awaken, and when she did, she awoke to the sound of Gaara quietly looking at the new seal on his stomach. Every time he flared his chakra, the seal darkened and came to life. Sakura recognized a yin-yang pattern, with some artistic additions, and resolved to ask Sai the meaning behind it when he awoke. "You said things were different." She spoke quietly to Gaara. "With you and Shukaku. What exactly did Sai do?" Shukaku keeps saying even he doesn't exactly know. The harmony of yin and yang energy is a very old concept. Before there was the 5 elemental nature transformations, humans used yin and yang transformations to harness their chakra. The implication of a perfect harmony between yin and yang is something that hasn't been considered since the Sage of 6 Paths. Gaara's gaze seemed to focus at this, and Sakura recognized the signs of Shukaku speaking to Gaara's mind, and Gaara listening in. Shukaku says, it was that balanced technique that allowed the Baijuya to exist at all to begin with. "So the Baijuya were created?" Sakura asked, baffled. "The way the legends speak of them, I thought they'd always just been." Gaara shook his head. "They're old, but I got glimpses of it." Shukaku's memories. Shukaku was created. Created, from something. He suddenly winced, grasping at his head. "I don't think Shukaku wants to talk about it." "So what you're saying is, Sai accidentally used a symbol that just happened to coincide with the technique that led to Shukaku's creation. So of course a seal like that would better integrate with the Baijuya's energy," Sakura concluded. "If I had to guess, Sai was intending to try and make a harmony between you and Shukaku. But he tapped into an older energy in the process. And it's that which has made the way your chakra interacts with Shukaku so much different than it was in the past." Symbiosis. Gaara finishes. "Our chakra aren't fighting each other. We sort of hit an understanding. I felt things, and Shukaku felt similarly. I think we have more in common than he'd like to admit." "You can say thank you whenever you'd like, Grumpy." Sai had finally awoken, and despite the bluntness, Gaara gave the boy a smile. "Thank you," he said plainly. "You saved my life. We made a promise, didn't we? A promise to keep Sakura safe. I guess you got added to the equation at some point." Sakura wasn't going to ask about the nature of this promise. Something within her thought to that night back in Taki, when Sai had come home with a black eye and the boys had very insistently lied about what the true problem had been. Had they come to an understanding back then? Was that when the promise had been made? I've been thinking about something, Sakura. Sai's voice broke her from her thoughts. Back when you were facing down Terra, the shinobi with the senbon, that electricity should have rendered you unable to move. Yeah, it definitely should have. Sakura agreed. But something happened. Yes. Those strange markings on your face. Markings. Sakura blinked. I don't remember any markings. Of course you wouldn't have. You weren't looking at yourself at the time. But there were markings on your face. Sai pulled out his notebook and began to sketch. They started at your forehead, but they spiraled outwards as you moved. They were dark. Black. I haven't seen anything like it before. He turned his book around so Sakura could see the drawing. It was her own face, but as Sai described, there were markings on it now. Dark lines made their way down her face, some of them merging together as they made their way towards her neck. At her forehead, the most prominent of the markings, there was a circle. One solid dark circle, and then a pale ring of unaffected skin around the circle, followed by dark markings again from which the others spiraled outwards. Was that really how I looked? Sakura asked, dumbfounded. She traced over the drawing with her finger. There was something familiar about the style of the markings, and though it wasn't exact, Sakura couldn't help but think. That was almost like what Haiden had looked like, back then. But Gaara had a different thought. He reached out to touch Sakura's back, his own hand tracing the white circle that had adorned Sakura's clothes for as long as she could remember. It's like the symbol you wear. He pointed out. The white circle? A circle isn't exactly unique. That has to be a coincidence. Sakura shook her head. Some weird sort of coincidence. A coincidence, but was it really? The visions she experienced, the sudden burst of power, it had to have come from somewhere. Maybe even given to her. I don't know what it was. Sakura admitted. But once our business here in Konoha is done, I'm going to find out. Chapter 55. On the final day of the second exam, Danzo came to her. It wasn't entirely unexpected, Sakura supposed. They'd foiled his efforts to kill him and remove Shukaku, and at this point the secret battle between them was more than personal. It was almost an honor to receive him, it meant that she had proven herself worthy of an audience. She had seen Danzo before, of course, at special Konoha events such as Tsunade's inauguration, but never before had she ever spoken with the man. Danzo had waited until the time was right. Technically, those who completed the second exam were not allowed visitors until the exam was completely over, but naturally these things did not stop the man. It was more than likely that at least one of the guards posted around the building was root anyway. Danzo announced himself with a light knock on their door, and it was Gaara who answered. The exchange that followed between them had been, admittedly a bit humorous to watch. Neither of them said a word, simply looking at each other with various glares and surly expressions until Gaara finally stepped back and allowed the man into the room. Danzo was alone, and perhaps that was the only reason that Gaara even allowed it. The boy had gained a bit of confidence with Sai's new seal, and had no doubt come to the conclusion that if Danzo tried anything, he could handle it. But Sakura did not think that she would die that night. Now that she had passed the second phase, she was no longer in the kill zone. Coming to murder her in her waiting room would draw an unwanted investigation. Danzo had wanted to take her out legally, without drawing any attention to Root or his manipulation of the foreign cage. He'd lost that opportunity, and as long as she was safe within Konoha's walls, it would be difficult for him to move against her again. No, Danzo just wanted to talk. Sakura was certain of this. He looked old, and with half his face and one of his arms completely bandaged, Sakura wondered at first how it was possible that such an unassuming man could keep reign over a group like Root. But within moments of his first words, Sakura realized that was the point. He had almost custom designed his look so as to appear unthreatening, to make people look the other way, but despite this his voice commanded presence. A shadow ruler indeed. Sakura Harano. He said simply. Danzo Shimura. Sakura let herself reply. They each sat across from each other in the room's lounge. Sakura noted that Sai watched from afar, but did not join them in the room. He was deathly afraid of his former leader, that much was apparent even from Sakura's peripheral glance. Danzo was not here to kill her. But that did not mean he was not a man to be feared. It is my hope we may speak plainly with each other here. Danzo began. I sent a dozen of my soldiers into the Chiryunin exams, and only one has returned to me. Clearly you have progressed as a shinobi far more than my reports have suggested. He reached into the folds of his robe, pulling forth a small brown folder. He opened it and began to read. Sakura Harino. You graduated from the academy as the top kunoichi of your generation, second highest student overall. Perfect written exam scores, an above-average grasp of Academy Taijutsu and the basic 3 Academy Jutsu. You were noted for having above-average chakra control and were recommended for genjutsu training, a recommendation that was ignored by your superior officer. At this point, Danzo looked up to Sakura again, and their eyes met. Sakura wasn't surprised by the file. Academy records were available to anyone of Chiryunin rank or above. But why bring it up now? You were placed in a team with the last Uchiha and the Jinhira boy. Danzo continued. And while you were noted to have performed adequately on your team's accidental A-ranked mission, and while you were allowed to take part in last year's Chiryunin exams, your development at that point, well, it was certainly subpar. Sakura frowned. So he was just here to insult her, then? No defining jutsu or techniques. No distinct fighting style. No experience in a specialized field that would have suited you, such as tactics or infiltration. It was more than expected for the Uchiha heir and the Jinhira to perform as well as they did. It was more than expected that you should fail while they succeeded. In fact, our system was designed as such. That caused Sakura to blink in surprise. A system designed for her to fail? It didn't make sense. Is it not the purpose of the academy to push forward as many capable shinobi as are needed for the village? You are correct. Most teams are concocted around a specialty, so that they may succeed and thrive under their jounin's tutelage. You can think of your own classmates as a fine example. Team 10 was put together naturally. The Yamanaka, Akimichi, and Nara clans have been working in tandem for generations. To separate them would be folly. They work excellently as an infiltration team, but also for specialized assault. Team 8 was put together as a tracking and reconnaissance team. The Byakugan's visual capability is almost unmatched. The Abarame clan beetles can be deployed in almost any situation without detection, and can be used to follow a designated prey over long distances. The Inuzuka clan, they speak for themselves. Those were just 2 of the teams designed under the Academy doctrine. Tell me then, Sakura, for what purpose was your team designed? The 2 top shinobi with the bottom graduate. I was told it was meant to compose a team that would be able to make up for the weaker shinobi. Sakura swallowed as she considered her team. Of course, in this particular case, the weaker shinobi was a Jinhira. Once he came into his Baijuryu's power, he could hardly be considered weak anymore. No, he could not. Danzo agreed. As I said, a civilian girl partnered with the heir of a powerful clan and, essentially, a fountain of chakra. The Uchiha are well-rounded. Their genjutsu proficiency as well as their ability to mimic the techniques of their foes makes them suited for information gathering, but they are more often used for more powerful assault formations. A Jinhira? A tool, a weapon for the village. A civilian girl. He looked to Sakura again, and she averted her eyes, realizing now exactly what the man was implying. I was the weaker shinobi. She admitted. But, it wasn't simply to make up for my deficit, was it? No. That team, that composition, for you specifically, Sakura Harino, it was a trial. With that, Danzo stood, his arms folded in front of him. He began to pace as he spoke, and Sakura was given the impression then that this wasn't a conversation that Danzo was used to having. The man seemed almost nervous. In every generation there is a graduate that is passed along to a team of titans. This graduate is often civilian-born, with no unique skills of their own, but often holding some measure of untapped talent. Placed into such a situation, alongside shinobi that naturally hold skill that initially far surpasses their own, this graduate has 2 paths that they fall into. They can fail under the pressure of living up to their teammates' accomplishments, or they can find drive and push themselves to match their teammates' accomplishments. Danzo continued to pace as he began to list shinobi. Your Jounin commander was part of one such team. His teammate Rin Nohara was placed similarly alongside an Uchiha and the sole remaining member of the once prominent Heitake clan. She thrived and found success as a medical shinobi, able to keep her teammates alive whenever they were injured on missions. The fourth Hokage, Minato Namikaze, is a fine example of succeeding in such an environment. His team also consisted of an Uchiha, as well as a Hyuga, and in spite of this it was Minato who caught the eye of his Jounin commander and ended up studying extensively under him as his apprentice, until such time as he became a fine shinobi in his own right. Of the three Sunin, as you know them, a civilian-born Jiraiya was placed alongside a member of the revered Senju clan and an orphaned prodigy, yet despite this he is known to be of equal strength to them today. So many teams set up under this mindset, Sakura realized. Several of which produced legendary shinobi. This method had been thought out. A no-name civilian might have faded to obscurity in a specialized team. In this sort of team, a civilian had a chance to become great. Though Sakura had to wonder how many of these crafted teams had ended in failure. Something Danzo had yet to address. Believe it or not, I, too, was in one such team. Danzo's voice pulled Sakura from her thoughts. An Uchiha, an Akimichi, and me, my father was a shinobi, but not one of reputation. Yet here I stand today, a Konoha councilman and second in command over the village behind the Lady Tsunade. Our successes were gambles, but it was decided before my time that if that was what it took to produce legends, then it was a gamble our village was willing to take. And thus, we return to you. Danzo stopped pacing, turning to face Sakura again. A no-name civilian girl who left the academy without any skills to her name other than her mind and a talent for chakra control. When faced with the success of your teammates, you found the drive to reach for something greater than either of your teammates thought to reach. The Uchiha seeks revenge. The Jinhuriki seeks the Hokage title. You seek to unite the shinobi world. You have taken the ambition to match your peers farther than any shinobi of your type has taken their own. It is unfortunate, truly, that such ambition is shrouded in naivete. You will not unite the shinobi world, Sakura Harino. It will be impossible. Sakura could not keep herself from standing up at this. It's only impossible because people like you stand in my way. She retorted angrily. If you hadn't been whispering in the ears of every cage that arrived here, I might have had most the world united already. United, perhaps, but for how long? How long do you expect each village to keep to your treatise? Do you truly think sand would stand for plains to take up their land and not experience justice for their rebellion? Do you truly think leaf and stone could put aside the animosity of 100 years of war? Do you think that cloud has forgotten the Third War? That mist can put aside their bloody history in search of peace? I have to think that. I have to. Sakura insisted. Because nobody else is thinking it. The only reason you think it's impossible is because you've never seen anyone try it. Maybe it won't happen in my lifetime. Maybe it won't happen for 100 years. But as long as the world knows the option is there, peace will come. They held each other's gaze for a while, and Sakura learned then just how it was that Danzo and Gaara could have an entire conversation with gaze alone. She held firm, and she could almost feel Danzo judging her then. He hadn't come here to lecture her, no. He had come here to see just what kind of person he was up against. Danzo finally nodded, and Sakura felt the tension in the room break. I see. He spoke. Then as it is, Sakura Harino, we have little more to discuss. I will be curious to see whose ambitions prove the greater. He turned to leave then, stopping only as he reached the door. That look in your eyes is very similar to someone I used to know. Oh. They used to call Hashirama Senju a fool for wanting to unite the warring shinobi clans into one villages. But whenever I saw the look in that man's eyes, I knew there was little he wasn't capable of. Then again, Danzo chuckled. He nearly lost it all at the hands of the man he considered his friend. His naivete could have led to Konoha's destruction. Danzo opened the door to leave then, saying only one more thing before leaving Sakura's sight. For your sake, I hope you are more prepared for the trials ahead. In the end, 10 teams did pass the second exam, meaning a total of 30 shinobi would move on to the next phase. Sakura and her team were herded with the others to a new building, and once she saw that the inside of said building was a large training field, Sakura knew that it was time for the exams to repeat themselves. There were still too many shinobi for the third, tournament phase of the exam. There would have to be preliminaries. As the examines were marched into the building, Sakura saw that there were, like before, upper levels where Jounin senseis and Kage alike had gathered to watch the preliminaries took place. Despite the fact that some did not have teams that had qualified, all of the Kage had shown up to watch, and Sakura knew it was to keep an eye on her specifically. There would be no relying on Gaara or Sai to back her up here. This would be a one-on-one fight, and if she didn't shine, that was game over. Her team had gotten several days of rest, which gave her an edge over a few of the teams. The Konoha rookies, of course, all looked ready for combat, as well as Lee's team, which had beaten the rookies by a full 20 hours. Sakura saw Fu's team as well, alongside a somewhat familiar-looking IWA team that had skated in during the final hour. She caught a glimpse of 6 Suna headbands, and from there the 2 teams remaining hailed from Kusa and Konoha respectively. A fair spread of teams, and Sakura's team had bested most of them in completing the second phase. Many of these shinobi looked tired, and Sakura prayed to whatever god had seen fit to look after her in the exams that she would face one of the tired ones. She would take an easy match after all she'd been through the past few days. Tsunade gave a speech, most of which Sakura was too nervous to pay attention to, and from there the participants were dismissed to the viewing stands. Then, a screen was brought forth at the front of the arena. Names began to flicker across the screen as the program chose the first 2 fighters. Sakura heard both Naruto and Lee yelling in the distance, each wanting to be first into the fray. Sakura wasn't quite sure if she wanted to go first or last. She'd had a couple of days to prepare, so why not get it done quickly? If she was allowed to stew with her nerves, it would only be detrimental. The screen halted, and Sakura's heart sank into her chest. Sakura Harano vs Rock Lee. Crap. Lee was one of the toughest fighters she'd ever met, and she'd seen what he was capable of when he'd faced Gaara last year. She wasn't going to be quick enough to keep up with his speed, and she didn't have Gaara's perfect defense. On top of that, how could she bring herself to put in her all against one of her best friends? It was different facing an enemy she didn't know, but a friend. Even when she'd faced Ino the previous year, there had been a part of her that had always held herself back. She felt both Sai and Gaara reach out to squeeze her shoulder before she turned and began to make her way back down to the arena. Lee, of course, was whooping with joy at not only getting to go first, but at getting to face his eternal rival. Sakura had wanted to see how she fared against Lee, but not here, not when the future of the Neutrality Pact was literally on the line. She didn't even realize she'd made it below until she naturally came to a stop in front of Lee. The exam proctor stood between them, explaining the rules of the match before lifting his hand to prepare to announce the match's start. Sakura's hands balled into fists. What was she supposed to do? Sakura. Lee spoke in a manner that was unusually serious, and his large eyes bored into her own with, not intensity, but something else, something Sakura couldn't identify. Please honor me by not holding back in this match. Sakura stammered. I have come here today to see how I measure up to my new rival. I want to make sure that our match is one that will be talked about for months to come. Lee shifted, settling into a stance. When I first met you, Sakura, I wanted to impress you. I wanted you to see me as a shinobi of great skill and value. It is funny now that you have instead become a shinobi that has impressed me. Sakura felt her heart pound stronger in her chest. Lee was he really saying? I want the people watching to see today that I am capable of standing on the same ground as the Kunoichi who will unite the shinobi nations. Even if I do not make Chiryunin today, I want to prove myself to you as I once wanted to when we first met. So please, Sakura, do not hold anything back. Let us show them what we are capable of. Sakura understood it then. Lee wasn't thinking about the Chiryunin exams any longer. Lee had figured out what was at stake. He wasn't just telling her not to hold back. He was telling her to put on a show. A show that he was going to put on with her. And who knew about putting on a scene more than the handsome devil of the Leaf Village? Everything clicked into place, and Sakura felt herself focus. She settled into her own stance, falling into a familiar figure of Iwa Taijutsu that Oniki had shown her months before. "All right, Lee." Sakura agreed. "Let's do this." The proctor's hand flew downwards, signaling the start of the match. From there, Lee exploded forward. A single hit from Lee would likely knock her unconscious, if not disable her. Defensive, for now, would be the key. The Iwa Taijutsu was one that was meant to be integrated with the use of Earth Jutsu for a maximum defensive technique, and though Sakura had not had long to learn it, she had been a student of the Tsuchikage himself and she would not let him down. She thrust chakra through her front leg and stomped her foot into the ground, at the same time rushing through a set of hand signs. A thick wall of earth erupted in front of her, just in time to intercept Lee's thrusting kick. But Sakura didn't allow herself to stop there. She thought back to Lee's fight with Gaara, and she remembered that the boy was able to turn on a time in order to attack from multiple angles. She swept her foot around her in an arc, pumping forth chakra and flying through the hand signs again and again until there was a circle of earthen wall around her. That only left above, and she couldn't afford to let Lee hop into her earthen arena and make this a close quarters fight. Sakura quickly threw her hands to the ground and created a tunnel beneath her. She dove into it and sealed it behind her, and the filling earth pushed her forward to the other side of the arena. She resurfaced just in time to see Lee jumping over her walls, and an idea sprung in her mind. Lee had lost sight of her, and it would only be for a moment, but that gave her more than enough time to set herself up. A few hand signs later, Sakura had generated 4 earth clones. Each of the clones went to a different corner of the room, drawing a kunai and preparing for a scuffle. The real Sakura, however, created another tunnel that connected her back to the interior of the 4 walls she had made before. As Lee hopped out of the wall's boundaries, he would be greeted by the 4 clones, not knowing that the real Sakura had made her way back into her walled sanctuary. It was a fast-paced game of hide-and-seek, and if Lee found her too early, that was truly game over. Still, Sakura hoped that the clones would distract him long enough for her to make some quick preparations. Despite his extravagant behavior, Lee wasn't an idiot. Once he'd figured out that the 4 Sakuras outside were all clones, he wouldn't just hop into her sanctuary again like he had before. That would just give Sakura an opportunity to perform the same trick again, hopefully wearing Lee out in the process. Since Lee wasn't an idiot, Sakura could assume that he would instead focus on break the wall down with his monstrous strength, that way she couldn't hide at all. Knowing that, Sakura could prepare. Unless Lee had suddenly found an interest in exploding tags, he would likely charge, taking a frontal assault against whichever wall was closest to him. All she had to do was keep track of where Lee was, and then time an offensive jutsu to hit right before his attack landed on her wall. She resorted to her sensing jutsu, which at first seemed like a potential dead end. Lee was a taijutsu user for a reason, his chakra reserves were minuscule. Her sensing jutsu barely picked up on him at all, and even then he was moving too fast for her to keep her eyes on him. However, Sakura found that she could sense the presence of her own clones, and that was the clue she needed to succeed. 2 of her clones were already down, and her third was moving back and forth, trying to duck and weave its way around Lee's attack. It didn't last long, however, which meant that Lee would be making his way to the 4th clone, and once that one was done, he would attack from that side. Seconds passed, and Sakura forced herself to breathe. Fighting Lee was intense, and he only gotten faster since the last time she'd seen him fight. As her 4th clone dissipated, she knew that she would have less than a second to figure out the timing of her technique. She risked one more sensing burst to confirm Lee's location. He'd stopped briefly, but the last thing her jutsu picked up on was his small bit of chakra rushing towards her. Sakura slapped her hands onto the ground and poured chakra, aiming for the other side of the wall in front of her. Behind the wall, an earthen pillar shot upwards, and Sakura knew it had hit when she saw Lee's somewhat limp form lifted into the air above the walls. Sakura allowed herself a mental cheer at landing the hit, but the celebration didn't last long. Lee recovered quickly, twisting in midair and using Sakura's pillar as a push-off point to launch himself into Sakura's sanctuary. Exactly what she'd been hoping to avoid. Shit. She narrowly dodged a kick from Lee, and from there she was suddenly caught in a whirlwind of fists and feet. Despite this, Sakura found that it wasn't impossible to dodge. Lee was definitely putting on a show of attacking her, but every now and then a punch was held back that might have knocked her out. Surely, Sakura thought, the cage would be able to tell that Lee was holding back, but then she remembered that they were surrounded by earth. Every spectator's view of the spar would be obscured, which meant this was a moment for each of them to catch their breath and figure out what they were going to do next. "Beneath you." Sakura spoke quietly, trying to mask it with her breathing. She saw Lee nod, and from there she put her next plan into motion. She ducked, slamming her hands down and generating several earth pillars around her. Lee had to jump high to avoid being hit, and as he expertly landed on top of one of the pillars, Sakura prepared another jutsu, one that Kakashi had been drilling into her since their time in Waterfall. She gathered chakra up into her mouth, letting the pressure build, until she expelled it into the form of a water bullet directly at Lee. Lee had to leap off of the pillar to dodge it, and instead of rejoining Sakura down below, he leapt backwards and out of the sanctuary. From there, Sakura let herself take a page out of Gaara's book. It had worked against Hiroshi, and while she couldn't maneuver earth as well as Gaara moved sand, she could mimic the effect if she was smart. Her hands flew, and she allowed herself to create another pillar of earth, this time angling it towards the wall that stood between her and Lee. She made the pillar thicker than usual, and the result was that the pillar hit the solid wall and began to push it outwards towards Lee. Sakura thought Lee would simply dodge, but the wall hit true, pushing into Lee and eventually collapsing the wall on top of him. Seconds passed, and Sakura took heaving breaths. Using so much earth jutsu in a short amount of time had already begun to drag on her reserves, and if the fight dragged on too much longer, she definitely wouldn't win it. It was no surprise to her when Lee crawled out of the rubble of her wall, and definitely not a surprise for Lee to push himself to his feet once again. "You have indeed become a strong shinobi, Sakura," Lee commented, and Sakura noticed that he was also breathing heavily. "If this fight goes on for much longer, I am afraid that I will not be able to keep up with you." It was a bluff, it had to be. Lee hadn't even removed his weights, but of course, there were only a few people in the room that knew about them. "Still, I have never been one to give up. Sakura, you promised me you would not hold back, so I shall honor you by not holding back now." Lee took up a fighting stance again, but as his eyes met Sakura's, he winked. This was going to be the end of the fight, and Lee was going to make sure it was a dramatic one. He would go at her with a frontal charge, and knowing that, Sakura began to pump the rest of her chakra towards her legs. The instant she saw movement, she pushed herself into the air, letting the momentum of her jump carry her into a flip. From there, she let gravity carry her downward, and aimed an arcing kick towards where she had been a moment before. Lee reached the spot quickly, fist at the ready, but Sakura could see that the boy hesitated at the last second. He was giving her an opening. Lee was giving her the win, and Sakura knew then and there that it would only dishonor him to hold back. Her kick landed with the back of his head, sending him slamming into the ground with a crack that made her wince. She landed on her knees, looking admittedly desperate as she checked to make sure Lee hadn't been too severely injured by the kick. The boy was breathing, but his eyes were shut. Unconscious, or pretending to be. "Thank you," she whispered to him, and she could have sworn she saw Lee's lips turn up in a small smile. She owed him one. No, she owed him a lot more than one. The cage got a show of her strength, she was moving on to the next round, and it was all because of him. The proctor called the match, and Sakura kept her head held high as she made her way back to the viewing stands. She would not let Lee's actions be in vain. As she rejoined her teammates, each of them moved to congratulate her. "You've made a proper mess of the arena," Sai commented. "Other shinobi will now have raised terrain to use to their advantage." "You're part of those other shinobi," Sakura pointed out. "You can thank me for my contributions to your success anytime. I won't thank you until I win. Hopefully I'll be matched with a shinobi within my skill level. I would hate to see myself paired up against one of the clan children," Sai answered, his gaze shifting to the Konoha rookies, who had all come to stand around her. "Though, if I'm against Brainless, I think I'll be okay." "Hey, you'd better watch it," Naruto growled back. "I'll mess up your pretty boy face if I have to take you on down there. Messing up my face won't make yours look any better. Why you little dash." The boys continued to bicker as the next match began. An IWA shinobi faced off against a Konoha shinobi, and the match was blatantly in Iwa's favor. The earth walls proved to be a vital bit of terrain for a shinobi of Earth Country, and the match was over in a matter of minutes. 3 more matches passed. Gaara was drawn for the 4th match, paired up against a Suna shinobi that immediately surrendered upon the match's announcement. Gaara still had a reputation in his village, it seemed, and given what he had been like the year before, Sakura didn't blame the shinobi for not wanting to take Gaara on. Fu took on another Suna shinobi, beginning the match with a passionate declaration to Hinata about showing off her skills. The opponent put up a decent fight, but there were few that could stand against the might of a trained Jinhuriki. Similarly so, Naruto took down a Kusa shinobi, using a simple technique that Sakura understood to be, fill the entire arena with clones and beat the shinobi down until they couldn't fight back anymore. She knew Naruto had been training other techniques, so she smiled when she realized that Naruto was purposely keeping those techniques a secret for the true 3rd phase of the exam. The preliminaries weren't all in favor of Sakura's friends. Tenten hit a wall as she faced down a Kusa shinobi with a wicked proficiency in genjutsu, and Ino hit a bad matchup as she was faced off against Shino. Match after match passed, and Sakura could almost see Sai getting more tense as his name was passed over again and again. There was a much smaller pool of shinobi to pick from now, and of those, some formidable opponents still remained. Those fears came to a head as Sai was finally called, on the second-to-last match. His opponent was none other than Niji Hyuga. Sai smiled pleasantly, and had only a single word to say. Fuck. Check the description for the links to the author.